Right, well, can I say welcome to everybody to this General Practice in Plymouth Select Committee review. Members, it is going to be a bit more awkward sort of finding out who wants to ask questions, but I am told that Ross will look one way and Amelia will look the other, and maybe between us all we'll get sorted. It's a good job it's slightly bevelled, isn't it, really, here? So, welcome to the committee. As I say, the committee is being webcast, so we need to be aware of that. And housekeeping rules are what are the normal ones. There's no fire alarm planned, so the drill plan, so if it goes off, we have to vacate. Right, any apologies?
No apologies, Chair.
Lovely. Declarations of interest.
Yes, Chair. Can I refer to the primary care presentation, which will be presented later on, and refer you to page 15, the merger in 2017 of the Glenside Medical Centre with the Beacon Medical Group. I'm actually chair of the patient participation group at Glenside Medical Centre, so I've been involved with the Beacon Group merger. So declaration would be personal.
And same for me, a personal interest in that I'm chair of the patient participation group at Freedom Health Centre. Anybody else with any declaration? Tony?
Yes, Chair, I'm a patient at Freedom Health Centre.
Okay, thank you very much. I have no urgent business, so we'll get on to the business of the day. Can I welcome Mark Proctor to our meeting? Mark, if you'd just like to give us 2 seconds of your role in the current NHS and then move on to your presentation. You have 10 minutes for your presentation. So I think you probably, I'm aware that you've sent something in this morning which the panel haven't seen, so we will do our best to help you with sort of understanding it as we go through. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me here. So I'm Mark Proctor. I'm the Joint Director of Primary Care for both CCGs in Devon, as well as Head of Primary Care for the local area team for NHS England. And it's in my NHS England role that I'm going to do this presentation, if that's okay. So it's quite a unique, innovative position. It's the first of its type where we've got an NHS England and CCG post joint. So it's quite helpful because it brings it back under one person. When you go out to talk to, particularly general practice, they can just talk to one person now rather than 2 or 3. So we're quite, been quite a positive step forward, and one that we hope to see replicated elsewhere. If we can move on to my presentation. Okay, so I thought it would be helpful just to start with a quote from the Director of Primary Care nationally, which I think helpfully summarises the importance of general practice in the NHS, both historically and currently, and the fact that it is internationally recognised, and that's something that we hold very dear, both as NHS England and locally here in Devon. But as you'll know, there's quite a lot of pressure being felt by general practice and primary care nationally, as well as what we're feeling locally. 90% of the contacts in the NHS go through primary care. About 80% of the referrals come from there as well, but only 10% of the current health spend is put through general practice, just to give you that sort of correlation. So you've got a big demand and small amount of spend. The pressures are coming from an ageing population increase, big focus now on local long-term conditions. People have multiple conditions, quite complex, and they're beginning to be more managed in general practice than they are elsewhere. And with that comes increased expectation from the public as well. With all the things in the health service at the moment, this is about trying to do more with less, and that's leading to quite difficult workload pressures that are becoming unsustainable, and that then naturally leads into workforce issues, both from trying to attract workforce in, but also retaining the workforce that we have. And then there's an ongoing change in general practice in particular. We're beginning to see a move to larger ways of working. That can be through federations or collaboration works all the way through to mergers. So we're starting to see that come through nationally. But that said, the traditional general practice model of a partnership and a sole trade and independent business is still being maintained even through that. So it's an interesting time for general practice to work its way through that. So in response to that, NHS England launched in April 2016 General Practice Forward View. And what I'm going to try and do is just take a few snapshots, if I can, just to give you a bit of context. So there's an overarching investment being made there. There's about 2.4 billion over the time frame of the 5 years that's covered in that documentation. And 5 million of that is going into sustainability and transformation, some of which has got to be found from within the CCG's baselines. That then leads into what do we need to do about the workforce. So recognising that we need to increase the workforce in general practice. To do that, it's not necessarily all about doctors, but we are trying to have 5,000 more doctors than the baseline that was taken at the beginning of that forward view. But we're also looking to bring in a different type of primary care workforce. So it's mental health therapists, physician associates, and we're looking to try and bring in the pharmacists and paramedics and all those sort of people in there as well. So it's covered by that. But it's also about investing and developing the existing staff in there. So it's about making sure we're investing in the practice management, development and capability in there, recognising that they're a key person in managing these independent businesses and beginning to sort of lead the transformation that needs to be put in there. But also recognising the nurse workforce in general practice is really important. We mustn't forget that. So a good investment focus on developing that. And there's now been a primary care nurse strategy approved, and we're starting to look to implement that as we go forward. So workload, as I've already said, there's unprecedented demand on the workload within general practice, and that's becoming quite difficult to sustain. So we're looking at other ways of dealing with that. So it's recognising, do we need to support the existing staff and general practitioners that are working in there? So how do we make sure we support them to make sure they stay well and healthy in the work that they do? There's a focus on releasing time to care. So it's looking at how we can focus on some key areas, what they call the 10 high impact changes, to try and make it more efficient, more effective in what we do in general practice, but also in those health and care services around them and how that interaction goes in there, so we're not got unnecessary duplication or workload being caused by that. There's some investment going into the reception staff so that they're able to navigate. These are key people in general practice. This is people that interact with the patients not on a first-time basis. They have the opportunity to make sure that patients and the carers and other people that contact general practice are sent to the right places. And that's not always necessarily within the general practice. That can be in the surrounding areas. And there's been some changes to the NHS contract to make sure that the providers that the general practitioners refer into are also providing effective care, so not unnecessarily causing workload back into general practice. There we go. So recognising that traditionally general practice has tended to be in converted houses or in some quite old buildings, there's a recognition that we need to modernise that, move those things forward. So there's been what's been called the Estates and Technology Transformation Fund over the last couple of years. 900 million of that nationally be made available to try and get ourselves into much more purpose, modern building, opportunities to co-locate with other services, so that we've got like a much more effective and modern approach to it all. There's also technology investment in there, try and start to enhance that digital technology so that we're catching up with where the population's working with and other things in there as well. Online consultation is the most recent example of that. Also recognising that the resilience of general practice has been an issue. There's been money that each on a recurrent basis to allow us to target particular solutions to try and retain and improve the resilience of general practice, and we'll come on to that a little bit later on in the presentation about where we've been doing that as NHS England more locally for Plymouth. So alongside all of that, to try and keep general practice robust and resilient and sustainable in its current form, we also recognise that we need to modernise and transform general practice so that it's fit for purpose going forward and is able to mirror itself alongside what we're doing in the rest of the health service. So there is part of the care redesign work, and there's money and support being made available to help general practice do that. So that slide just summarises all those slides in one helpful, hopefully, summary for you to have in the pack. So in Devon STP, just so we can link it into some more local areas, the Sustainability and Transformation Partnership has recognised primary care as one of its main priorities. Again, linking into delivery of the GP Forward View and that national position, it recognises that general practice is really important. We need to wrap services around it, and for it to be able to do that, it needs to be robust, sustainable, and able to provide the modern services. And to do that, you need to develop the workforce and have the services available when and where they're needed. It also recognises that primary care, whilst important in its own role, plays an important function in delivering all the other priorities within that plan. So they have a key role in prevention and early intervention, in self-care, in the integrated care model, because it is the centre of all of that. It is the alternative to hospital-based services. They will provide the core support and services to do that. And they can actually hold much more of the population away from those sort of traditional models if we've got a modern, sustainable and robust service there. Just to give you a flavour of Devon as we come down into the more local thing, we've got 138 practices across Devon at the moment. We do have good quality services across Devon. All our practices are rated good or outstanding by the CQC. We've got about 877 GPs in Devon currently, just under 600 practice nurses, which is a big workforce that we need to retain and build on. Over the next 5 years, we would expect to lose a quarter of those staff. So we need to be planning now to make sure that we can maintain that, but also increase that workforce going forward. But we're also carrying a very high level of vacancies, and that's particularly relevant in Plymouth, where we've got about 25 whole-time equivalents for general practice vacant currently. And down to a couple of things, just wanted to make a highlight in there about, as I already did at the beginning, that the post I'm in now is quite one of the sort of innovative solutions we're looking to try and integrate to start supporting some of the work going forward on that. Just to reiterate how good quality we've got general practice in Devon, this is a table, it's a bit difficult to see on the screen, but hopefully clear in your pack. The different ratings CQC gives to general practice. These are the highest scoring STP areas. Just to highlight, Devon is in the top 5 for the number of practices it has as outstanding. So for our local, so the Plymouth and Western locality, we've got, I think it's 42 practices to be exact in the locality currently. Every single one of those is currently rated as good. We know from the work that we're doing currently that because we've got some resilience issues, particularly within the Plymouth practices, that's having a negative impact on the workload of the emergency department in Derriford. We recognise that, we're working on it, but that's a very good example of the interrelation between primary care and the other sectors of health. So just to give a sort of synopsis of the work we've been doing locally for general practice, there's been, as you're I'm sure aware, some closures locally since March, which is just where these have been small struggling practices. We've had to close them to do that. So we do try to work alternative solutions so we don't move the closure as a first point of a solution, trying to work out how we can do that, but sometimes these are inevitable. So those ones have been concluded. And then the second section in there where we've been able to put an interim provider, we have done, Access Health has done a good job of taking over the 3 contracts and settled for Mount Gord and Trelawney, and they're ongoing, and that's moved into further work going forward. But that has stabilised those practices into a position where we can now work for a more sustainable solution going forward. And as we heard from the declaration, Freedom Health Centre is another practice where it got itself into a position where we ended up having to take the contract was handed back to NHS England. We've worked with practices. The best solution for that was to move it into the Access temporary contract holder. We were able to move them to Mount Gold, and they've become part of a more broader piece of work that we're doing to try and get ourselves an upscale provider going forward. Unfortunately, for Dumbarton, we had 2 failed procurement processes. So we're trying to work through a solution in there. We've got quite an innovative approach there where we might end up with a pharmacy-led service that can provide general practice service on top. So we're doing some more work on that, and I think David Bierman will pick that up in his presentation later. The merger of Glenside is another example of a piece of work where you can do some, if you've got surrounding practices that are able to provide a robust solution, that's a good example of how we can merge practices to get in that scale offering for a more broader process that allows a very good example of general practice to spread its services more broadly. Ocean Health, I'm sure, is something that we've all been aware of. That was a very difficult process. We've worked really hard with the practices and with some temporary solution, and more recently with Access Health, to get ourselves into a stable situation with that practice. That's now been achieved. We're starting to see an improvement in the services, better support for the patients. I think we're beginning to see the feedback to say that we're probably on good track with that. That's also gone in with the previous practices so that we're able to do a very large procurement for a broad spectrum of the population in Plymouth. We're in the procurement process, as one of the slides later on says, so, but we're hopeful that that will come out very positive in the near future. In that structure. More recently, Leigh Park Surgery have felt the need that they've had to hand a contract back due to partnership changes there. We've worked really hard alongside the CCG with the surrounding practices to have a managed process so that patients are able to go to the surrounding practices in a way that's not going to cause them to become or make their resilience worse. So we've got a good process in there. We're working with the patients at the moment to try and do a managed transfer before that comes to an end in March next year. So I've alluded to the procurement for Ocean Health, and the other things is covering a population of 34,000. We've done a couple of market engagement processes. We're part way through that procurement, so unfortunately we don't know what the outcome will be. It's an ongoing process, and we are confident at the end of that procurement we'll have a very modern approach to sustainable general practice. I'm running out of time, am I, Mary? Sorry, I apologise. So just this final slide is just to show some of the immediate work we're doing with the practices and the CCG to try and create some sustainability and robustness locally. So we've got an innovative approach to the indemnity scheme. We've got a home visiting service to help with discharge to assess issues in Plymouth, and then the workforce bits. We've got Plymouth has been identified nationally as an area that NHS England would want to support, so we've got the international recruitment and some interesting approaches to retainment for the staff as well.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the rest of our people that are presenting this afternoon, when we say 10 minutes for a presentation, we mean 10 minutes? Because to me, the whole idea of this scrutiny is the questioning, and that to me should be taking up the lion's share. So, Mark, no points on that for your timing, I'm afraid. You go to the bottom of the queue on that. Right.
We had a lot to share.
So, I'm going to make sure that we get our questioning in. But, Dr. Mahoney, you're first on the list.
Thank you for that. I suppose I ought to declare an interest, but I have been retired 4 years. None of it surprises me. 15, 20 years ago, there are probably people in this room who will know that I was saying all the money is going into secondary care, it's all going into recruiting more consultants, more hospital services. At the time, things were being transferred into general practice, long-term conditions, and it wasn't going to last. So I'm pleased to see there's money now. I mean, it's come probably 15, 20 years too late. We all knew there were a lot of GPs who were about to retire in the last few years because they were reaching that sort of age. But locally, we have warnings about this because it must be 15 years ago that Ernesettle, the one in Ham and one in Mount Gold, actually sort of handed back their contracts and the CCG started running them. So we had warning of this, must be 15 years ago now, and it's no surprise to me that smaller practices have actually joined the queue.
Dr. Mahoney, have you got a question rather than a statement, please?
The question is, are we actually going to get ourselves out of this problem? Because it's been a long time in the making. There's a big shortage of people who want to work in general practice, and are we really going to attract them and keep these smaller practices going?
So the short answer would be yes, because I think the plans we've got in process will get us there. It'll take a little bit of time. The recent news release was we've had more people in general practice training this year than we've ever had before. We want to continue to do that. So I do think we will get there with some of the changes that were in my presentation. It won't be a quick fix, and it needs to be linked into what the council's doing around making Plymouth in particular a place to come and live and work. and we need to work with Health Education England and the university, which through Nicola and the team we are doing. So I am confident that we will turn this corner around and have a very positive and vibrant primary care service going forward.
Thank you. Sudan?
I don't know how many bites of the cherry, so I'm going to give you 3 questions.
Okay. Ooh, very well.
The first one is just how many vacancies have we currently got in Plymouth? Because it doesn't actually say in here, so that's the first question. The second question is around the closure of Leigh Park Surgery. We had a scrutiny about closing of the other surgeries across the city, and we were constructively critical at how the communications had gone with the patients and how the patients were actually engaged and consulted with through the process. We felt that it wasn't done in a very open and transparent way, and that decisions were made without the patients having the opportunity to give their viewpoints. That's the second question. And then the third question is, I see that you know, in terms of the vacancies, getting people in, I'm just looking for the right bit of paper. You've talked about the ability to recruit GPs from overseas, and I also know that's a work stream as well in the Western Locality Primary Care Improvement Plan. I just wanted to know, how was that going to happen? Because whether we like it or not, the number of overseas applications, especially from European countries over here, is falling rapidly, and we need those people in order to be able to fill the short-term gap of the current vacancies. So there's 3 questions.
Okay, so the vacancies in Plymouth, I might look to Nicola as well, 25 whole-time equivalent general practice vacancies. There will be a number of nurses things in that. Some of those, well, actually a majority of those have been for quite some time. So we are trying to work and support practices, both from NHS England and the CCG, to help them through that, and with comms and other opportunities, and looking to see how we can retain or bring back recently left GPs to fill those vacancies. So that's one of the areas in there. So Leigh Park, the patient engagement process, sometimes these contract handbacks come back quite short notice, unfortunately. But we are working through it. We have worked with the patient support group, and we've had patient drop-in centres to get and talking to the sort of surrounding practices to find out what might be the best way of providing services to that population if we haven't been able to keep that practice going in the longer term, which we haven't been able to do. Hence the reason why the 2 practices are either side of it are happy to take the patients, and we're working with the patients and the patient support group to do that as best as we can. There's always opportunities to improve, and we take learning and we do reflect on each one of these that we do to try and make sure we do it properly. We work with our Health Watch colleagues and other places, so that hopefully we're getting better at that, and if there's any additional feedback, I'm happy to take that away. And then the overseas recruitment, this is a particular national scheme that's been launched to try and help areas like Plymouth take that opportunity. So we're just going through the application process. We know we're a priority area. We'll wait to see how that comes out, but it's a joint piece of work with NHS England, the CCG, PHT, Health Education England, and the med school, because it takes that kind of collective to be able to support these overseas GPs as they come in. They come and we have to offer them a 3-year contract minimum, and we want to be able to plug our GP gaps for as broad an area of the service as we can. So again, we're confident that will help, but it won't be the entire solution, but we would like that to be as successful as we can.
Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. David?
Thank you, Chair. Mark, thank you for your presentation. Appreciate it. Very, very helpful in actual fact. I'd like to talk a little bit about Plymouth. As you know, we have an ageing population, and with the ageing population often comes complex needs, and packages of care are going up in price. And we are committed to keeping people in their own homes as long as we can with this package of care. My concern really is about the workforce. You've already mentioned in here about problems with recruitment and retention of GPs. And now I take it that we apply to other clinicians and also to carers. Could you give me an update on the position in Plymouth, where we stand with regarding the workforce? Do we have the right skills in the right place to deliver these packages of care?
So just to clarify, so
I don't want a straightforward yes.
So you're particularly asking about social care support staff on that one? primary care. So we know we've got a shortage of staff to keep the model as it is currently. So some of the work that we've articulated is how do we get those vacancies filled. So then we'll go through, if we can do that, then we'll need to work on training and enhancing the different skill mix that general practice has to be able to provide the support as we bring care away from the hospital, which I think is what your question's about. Yeah. So we're probably not at that point across the whole of our practices in Plymouth and the western locality. Some practices do have that, some don't. So we'll need to work on that going forward over the next year or so to ensure that that's there. I think that they're attractive employment to do that. We just need to start offering the training schemes to do it.
So my question, I suppose, really, do we have elderly patients at home with perhaps complex needs who are not getting the services which they should be getting because of the shortage of staff in Plymouth?
Because we've got a very good general practice on CQC rating on that. I think from the current model that we have at the moment, I think general practice is supporting its patients appropriately with the staff that it has. Because I think we're in that transition. We haven't yet completely implemented a new care model where the patients are coming out. So I think we need to make sure as we do more of that new model of care transfer that we make sure that the staff are able to cope with it. But I think that's that workload question. We know the workload is growing and we need to make sure that the workforce continues to increase with that.
I hear what you're saying, but I'm not actually convinced of what you're saying, quite honestly. Thank you.
Councillor Tuffin?
Thank you, Chair. If I may, because we only received this today, it may seem a very simplistic question, but if I go back to your presentation, investment 2.4 billion, I mean, my question would be, what does that mean for Plymouth? And going on to the next bit, the Sustainable and Transformation Package, 500 million. How much of that would be internal savings rather than new money? Because if we're going to understand this, we need to have them facts. And my third question, very quickly, would be general practice forward view. What timelines on some of these numbers? Because once again, they look to me to be national numbers rather than local numbers. So it's very difficult for us to get a picture of Plymouth from this presentation. So my question is, how much would be internal savings? So is that a true view of 500 million investment? The national picture, 2.4 billion, how much of that is Plymouth? And I accept, you won't have the exact details. And the timeline in the forward view.
Okay, so the GP forward view timeline is probably the one I can do the most quick, because that is a 5-year plan. So from 2016 to 2021. So that's the idea, is to try and have all those things in place and embedded in that time frame. The 2.4 billion is new money that's going into general practice. Majority of that will go into the actual contract that's negotiated nationally that pays the GPs. So it goes into, depending on what type of contract and how they do it, into that area. So, and a small amount of that is then available through other means. So then they'll have already started seeing that. We don't control that locally. That is part of a national negotiated process. The 500 million investment for transformation and sustainability, so some of that will be savings that the CCGs have to make to be able to take it out of their baseline to invest into general practice, £3 a head, that needs to be done between now and 2019 is an example of that. Some of the other is new money or internal savings managers England that has to be bid for. So the bidding process, so again, depending on how successful you are in that bidding process, determines how much money comes in locally. We've been reasonably successful in doing that to date.
Well, thank you for your answers, but it does worry me that gives a false picture of the forward plan if it's not the true actual amount of money. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Carson.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Mark. Very pleased to see that there's nearly £1 billion pledged for infrastructure and estates. But turning to Barton, which should be a prime example of that. Very concerned that no GP practice has taken that up. Would that have anything to do with the level of income offered per head of patient?
Yeah, so I think, back to that sort of the way that the traditional contract for general practice is currently set up does make it very difficult for those type of populations to attract somebody in. There are new models of contracting available that we need to have a look at. Having pharmacy-led with general practice is one of those opportunities to try and do that in a more sustainable way. Some of the other ways are trying to work more at scale, so we can work with a bigger provider and perhaps. So we just need to explore all those opportunities. But yeah, in essence, to answer your question, the traditional model does make it very difficult.
So can we have your reassurances that Barton will go ahead, and if it needs some extra funding, that you'll get it over the line?
So we are working very hard to make sure that we do that. We know that population needs primary care services, and we will make sure that they get the appropriate primary care services. What the exact model will be dependent on many factors. If we can resolve it locally, we will.
Thank you. Councillor Bridgman.
Thank you, Chair. Mark, you mentioned in your presentation a pharmacy-led service. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because that sort of sets alarm bells ringing a little bit. I've got visions of people walking into Boots and standing in front. So could you have a look at my toe? Or could you just tell me a little bit more about that, please?
So we are proposing, and I wouldn't want to steal David's details. You may want to save that one for the presentation at the end when he arrives. But in essence, it is using the pharmacy building to provide general practice services, but there would be the appropriate consulting room and setup for doing that. So but it isn't an interesting way of doing it because the pharmacy has a different way of funding, so we can try and use the money in a more innovative way to provide services that community needs. But we would have to do it appropriately.
Can I have another question, please? Quickly. Just very quickly. On page 5, it says here, under workload, 30 million releasing time for patients, programme to release capacity. What does that actually mean? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that one as well for me, please? So yes, that's the name of the programme. The idea being is we look at ways of trying to reduce the bureaucracy and some of the admin tasks that are done, particularly by GPs or other clinicians in general practice, so they have more time with the patients rather than sort of running the business or dealing with some of those processes. That's what the 10 high impact charges are. It's releasing time for care.
Thank you. Councillor Sparling.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mark. It does strike me that the recent closures and earmarked closures fall most heavily on areas of our city with the most challenged demographics. In the ward I happen to represent, for example, is it right to conclude that these particular communities are experiencing greater pressures than others? And if so, what measures are being employed now to mitigate such pressures on our most vulnerable citizens?
So I think the populations that those practices have been serving are a group that perhaps have used health services in a higher rate and have become more dependent on it than other areas of the city. So we are looking at how do we provide the services that they need in a different way. Does it need to be a traditional general practice model? Can we put other services in there to support them? And so that's part of the review that we're doing currently to make sure, through like Mayflower procurement, to make sure that we're doing that in a more modern way, but making sure they have the services they need. Some of that will be about self-care, and some of those other sort of taking some of the responsibility self and using the voluntary sector and other things. So we're working through all of that, and again, we would want to do that in partnership with our other people that can help us do that. Is that okay?
Yeah, I suppose that goes some way to answering my question. I was trying to get more at whether or not there is less access to provision to a GP for residents in those areas than other perhaps more affluent areas in the city at the moment, given recent developments. So I'd be interested to know if that is true or not, and if that is the case, what's being done to mitigate that imbalance.
So I think anybody that needs to see a GP can access a GP. So I suppose some of the discussion needs to be around what is it that you're seeing a GP or going into general practice for, and can that be more appropriately delivered by somebody else? And that's what we're looking at. So if you need to see a general practitioner or a nurse or whatever, then yes, you'll still have access to it. It may not be as close to you as it once was, but you'll have access to that.
And Dr Mahoney?
Thank you, Mark. How are you monitoring the larger practices? Beacon seems to be quite successful, but Ocean was expanding and taking over a number of practices, and then it failed. The worry is smaller practices fail, you have a smaller problem. If one of the bigger practices failed, what would happen? How are you safeguarding this, and what controls have you got on amalgamations?
So they're obviously each practice is an independent, as you'll know, are independent businesses. So we only have access to the information that we'll know through our contract mechanisms or our performance, stuff like that, unless the practices choose to share that more business information, depending on what it is that's caused them to be vulnerable. We do work very hard with them to go through a due diligence process to make sure that those mergers are being done in a robust manner and they are going to achieve the outcome, and try and identify support with them and the patient support groups and others to make sure that they have the best chance of success that they do.
Thank you. David?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm just going back to the page 10, which is the primary care roll across the STP priorities. There's about 7 priorities here, as you can see. Sustainable, high-quality primary care, which we talked about earlier on. I'm not quite sure how you're going to deliver that. Do you have action plans, delivery plans, which we could look at to see how you're going to proceed along this line?
Yep, so I think that will link into some of the
Okay,
work
I understand. I understand it
Plymouth
come under the
will do.
CCG as well, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other one, a question I was going to ask you again, which will involve the CCG, but it's about the health inequalities in Plymouth itself. For years and years, as long as I can remember, we've always had health inequalities in the city, and it don't seem to be getting any shorter. It seems to be getting wider, quite honestly. How are you going to address that?
Ruth smiling in the corner down there. So I think, okay, so I think part of that process is making sure that we work collectively. So that's across the council, NHS England, the CCGs, on our other partners, to make sure that we've got really good understanding of the need of the population and the best services and the support mechanism to ensure that we achieve that over the coming time. That's a long-term piece of work, but we need to start doing it together.
I have been a councillor for 20 years, and I've heard this time and time again. We're getting no further. It's going to, the equalities are worsening, quite honestly. So again, I'm not convinced how we're addressing these inequalities, and it's important that we do, certainly in Plymouth.
No, I think we would all accept that, and I do think this partnership working and being able to do that, general practice recognises it's got a key role in prevention, in doing that. So we just need to make sure we're a bit more joined up than perhaps we have been previously.
Councillor Tuffin?
Thank you, Chair. If I may, I'll come back to the St. Budo question, because I recall the first time NHS England came to us and talked about the serious situation GPs surgeries and their inability to be able to employ GPs. They promised that that part of their scheme would be a surgery would be put in place at St. Budo. And now we hear it's going to be a pharmacy. And quite frankly, I'm really disappointed in that, because the whole concept of having to close some GPs was sold to us on the fact that it would improve the service. And that's obviously not going to happen. So I guess one of my questions would be, who has governance in NHS England? Because so far, my experience is it's failing. I mean, you may well say, oh, the doctors give in their contract, and that's nothing to do with us. But I don't see it in those terms. I see these organisations to be in a position to be answerable to somebody for being successful organisations, not just the fact of, we'll react to the situation when it comes. So, 2 things. Really disappointed in St. Budo, and I generally believe we were sold on that scheme that we would make improvements in Plymouth, which is not going to be forthcoming. And secondly, I'd like to hear the governance of your organisation as is now, who they're answerable to, because it appears they're not really answerable to the public of Plymouth, are they?
Okay, so the question around the pharmacy-led general practice, so I think we are trying to put in the appropriate primary care services into that area. It's just being done through a different model, which is something that we need to explore, because the traditional models may not always be the right ones or affordable. So we just need to be able to explore that, and I think that's one possible. I think it's quite an exciting opportunity to deliver services in a different way, and we should try and help support to do that. From a governance point of view, NHS England does do contract and performance reviews with general practice to make sure they're providing appropriate care within the requirements of the contract. CQC goes in to make sure that it's of a reasonable quality, or appropriate quality and safe. So I do think there is appropriate governance in there. There are factors that make these small businesses vulnerable at times, and not always is that visible to everybody when we have those conversations. It is a requirement for a dialogue and some honesty on all sides from that, really.
Thank you for your answer, but I'm certainly not satisfied.
Councillor Dan.
Okay, so I suppose there's two questions here. I'll get a double bite of the cherry. So the first thing, I don't really understand. So we have, most of the doctor surgeries are delivered in small partnerships, and part of the reason they close is financial. So is there a mechanism where we can pump prime these doctor surgeries so they've got the right equipment and things to get the efficiencies of scale that we need to build bigger practices? Is one. Number two, by having a service that has got 34,000 patients in, that sounds a lot to me, spread over quite a large geographic area. Where we've seen these big GP practices in the city, the patient care and actually the accessibility to get to see a doctor in a timely fashion has diminished. You know, the difficulty of getting to see a doctor within a week, you can quite often get 3-week appointments and you have to get in a car and drive 10 miles to get to the nearest one. So that's the first thing. And then the second part of my question then is that, you know, in the city we've got money coming in to make sure that we get people out of hospitals quicker so there's not bed blocking and we give more supportive care at home. We're looking at health and wellbeing hubs, which brings that whole health agenda back into local communities. But it seems that the GP provision is moving away because we're not having so many GPs in local communities. So there's a bit of a disconnect in where we want the city to be. Two big questions.
Okay. So your first question around the what are we doing to help fund and support practice into getting the benefits of scale working? Yeah. So that's part of that resilience funding, sustainability funding that I referred to in the presentation. So there is money to support solutions to try and help practice get to a size where they are less vulnerable than they are currently, so become more sustainable. So we do work with them and we can fund that on a short-term basis, and we do that. And we are doing that with Ocean and other people to try and get ourselves to a point where we've got sustainable care for those patients. So I think the short answer, yes, we do, and we work with them. Once we've identified the appropriate solution, we do work to do that, to try and get them to that position. So
that can be a capital cost as well as a revenue one then? So if they need extra equipment or something to make the buildings more efficient, it comes in that.
So there are different funding sources to try and do different things. So yes, it depends. It's probably not a simplistic yes or no, because it depends on what it is that we're trying to achieve as an appropriate outcome. But we do our best to help as best we can. That's the point of that. So your second question about the size and making sure that it provides the care, I think that's an interesting balance, and we do need to try and make sure that we get the at-scale working that still delivers the right type of care and access that the population needs. And sometimes we don't always get that quite right straight away, but it's about feedback and changing the model to make sure we get it right. So I do think we get there eventually. Some of the practices that at scale that I think you're referring to probably haven't had the workforce to be able to deliver that service at the level that is needed, but I think we're getting there as we begin to recruit into those vacancies and change the skill mix. So I do think we're starting to see improved access over time, because it will come, because this at-scale working allows us to do that. And then the health and wellbeing centres question. So the health and wellbeing centres and general practice should start becoming one. They should be one approach. So the general practice and that local community for the health and wellbeing centres, they're core. The health and wellbeing centres are supposed to be wrapping themselves around the general practice services for those populations. So I don't think they are disconnected. We probably need to show how that works in a way that people understand. But the whole concept is to have the general practice at the centre of those.
Right. If I bring you back to the Western Locality Primary Care Improvement Plan that you'd sent out earlier on in the week,
Yep.
on what is the third page, I suppose technically, there's talking about models of care and developing provision for primary care and you've got certain targets there on that. It's this one here
That might
you
not be my
sent out.
presentation, Mary. Is that Nicola's presentation?
No,
No?
it was sent.
Oh, the actual plan itself. Okay,
Yes,
I
the
don't
plan itself.
know. Okay.
Can somebody give Mark a copy of it? He hasn't got it. What it's basically saying is there's a lot of things that are saying by December the 17th. Now, I reckon that's 2 days away. So really, I want to know what's happening about this. Are you really looking at December 17 or has that slipped? Because one of the things there is about financial risk, etc. So I want to be selfish. I'm thinking about the Plymothians out there, the ones that we work with, that are within our constituencies, that we see day in, day out, not always having complaints about their GP services. In fact, some very, very sort of pleased with what they've got. But at the moment, we're seeing more GPs giving in their contracts. We're seeing the procurement process is not perhaps proceeding with the speed that we'd hoped. And so I want to be reassured that by April next year, we're going to have a stronger GP service in Plymouth, and that we aren't going to be getting concerns from our constituents, because everybody is seeing people in appropriate times. And I know Karen, no doubt, will have stuff from Health Watch that will be able to flesh concerns out on that for us. So I'm not expecting you to do that. But what I want to know is your models of care, where are they in the process?
Okay, so I'd hope I'd get a bit more than 1 day in December, Grace, to be able to deliver those things. So yes, a lot of the actions were in there. I think I'll look to Nicola slightly because I think she'll want to bring this out in her presentation. Most of those things are on track for delivery and starting delivery at some point during December, if some haven't already started. So I'm confident that we are getting those things in train, and they will start to have a positive impact as we go through and they become embedded going forward. I'd share your ambition to have primary care in a much better place by April 2018, and we are working really hard, both in NHS England and the CCG, to achieve that.
Okay, right. One more question for you, and then we will free you up. In August, following Ocean Health quitting its contract, in response to the claims by Dr. Mark Sanford from the LMC that GP practices in Plymouth were unviable due to severe work shortages, you suggested that this could be bring about exciting opportunities. 4 months later, what are those opportunities we should be excited about?
So, just to clarify, to make sure, we're talking about the wider procurement of Mayflower in that, or just particularly Ocean in itself?
I think Ocean in particular.
Ocean in particular. Okay, so the work, we recognise that practice it's got quite a big population and quite a diverse and needy population from a health and social care perspective. So we needed to focus on stabilising that, and I think we've probably just about got to that point where it's now stabilised. So we can start to build on that, starting to look at how we can provide the different services with our partners like Live Well and things like that, to start having a different workforce and service delivery from the practices rather than other areas. So we'll be doing that. Ocean has become part of that Mayflower procurement, so it's joined some of the other practices where we're looking for a much larger at-scale offering, so we can increase those opportunities of what we can do and see whether we can attract some different service providers offering that. That, I think, will start to provide those exciting opportunities. What I can't do, because we're in a procurement exercise currently and it's not concluded, is share where we are or what the outcome of that's likely to be, because we're at that tricky point in the procurement process. We just can't do that because of giving away the confidentiality, the commercial confidentiality issues. But we're working on it, and we would share. We want to have that exciting new approach to primary care come out of that procurement.
We will await with bated breath.
I look forward
Mark,
to you asking me again.
can I thank you very much for coming there? Maybe we should have had 2 black chairs over there so that at least we can sit you in a black chair. Thank goodness there's no spotlights here. So, but thank you very much indeed for coming and taking part in this. No doubt this will be the start of us looking at future of GP services in Plymouth. So no doubt we will see you back here.
Thank
you very much indeed. Nicola and team, can I invite you to come over here? Can I welcome you to the meeting? Who's going to take first bite? It's you that starts the trouble, isn't it? Yeah. Do you want to put the microphone on, please?
Yeah, so I do apologise, I'm slightly blocked up today as well, but as Daft said, I've just got to man up and get on with it, and that's so
that was off the record, Craig.
That's the quality of GP advice in the city there, Chair.
Is that because you can't get a GP appointment?
I can, you see, I'm very fortunate, I've got my own personal one. So I would just like to introduce the team. You know me by now, it's Craig McArdle, Director of Integrated Commissioning. I'm here with my New Devon CCG hat. I've got Nicola Jones, who's my Head of Commissioning, who focuses a lot of her time on primary care in the city. And then I've got Dr. Daffy Jones, who's our clinical lead in the CCG, working 2 days a week with us around the urgent care system in particular, but he's also a practicing GP as well. We have literally got 8 slides, one of which is the opening slide, and then the last one is a bit of a plug for Stay Well Plymouth, and we've got other poster boy here today who's doing some of the promotion on it as well, so that's really helpful. The presentation will cover the CCG's role in primary care commissioning, what actions we are taking locally to support the big ambitions that NHSE set out today, and then just a bit of where primary care sits within the wider context, system context, which I know you're all interested in as a panel as well. So I'll rattle through and then hand on to Nicola. So primary care commissioning, really, as you well know, panel, CCG aren't the commissioners for primary care. However, we recognise we have a big role in this. Absolutely, we have a role. And there's a spectrum of involvement, really, through the greater involvement where we are at the moment, through to joint commissioning, through to delegated commissioning. South Devon and Torbay, where Mark's originally from, is at the joint commissioning stage, that's right. And I think there's an aspiration at some point in the future we'll move towards working to to become delegated commissioners as well. So we're on that spectrum at the moment. We are at the greater involvement, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of Nicola's time is now devoted to that greater involvement as well, because we see it as so important to the whole system. As we rightly point out, it's part of a wider system, and this just alludes to some of Mark's presentation slides earlier, so we won't dwell on this because we want to get into local actions and local initiatives really, but it is around workload, workforce, infrastructure, sustainability. And it's just to reflect we are part of a wider system, but we're also part of the 5-year forward view in the STP as well. You've seen this, it's in the pack as well, so I won't dwell on it much, but we do have the plan which Nicola and the team's worked with Mark on to put together as well, and we're going to pull out a few of the local actions, because I think there are some initiatives that we are cracking on with and it will start to make a difference as well. This is, and I'm stealing Nicola's slide because I really want to get onto the detail, this is around how we're constructing GPs within the city. And Nicola will talk a little bit more around this, but we are thinking around those 4 groupings really of Beacon, which you've heard a lot about, Sound, Drake, and then South Hams Alliance and West Devon as well. But the point around this really is there's lots of wraparound support around these GP emerging federations, and it's important that you see it in the wider context really. And I'm going to hand over to Nicola, who'll rattle through.
Thank you. So, panel, you've had a copy of the condensed version of our primary care improvement plan. Important to note, as Craig alludes to, that has to be developed in partnership with other organisations. So CCG hold that. We develop it with NHS England, with Plymouth Hospitals, NHS Trust, with Live Well, with the GP practices themselves, with the local pharmaceutical committee, and so on. I have a strapline. We are all on the same side. We are all ultimately trying to achieve the same thing, and let's work in that way. Not duplicating, getting the synergy of working together. I'm going to pull out just probably 3 key examples of some of the urgent highlights of our plan at the moment. One is around recruitment. So GP practices are, many will be constantly looking at recruitment, trying to find ways to successfully recruit to their posts. We've started a piece of work with Plymouth City Council. What is it that we can do to better enable GP practices to be able to recruit? Started a conversation with Judith Harwood and the Employment Skills Board. What is it that we can do to collectively, with some funding that we have now from Health Education England, to get Plymouth with the right straplines, Plymouth with the right reputation in that recruitment market across the country, so that not only can we better recruit GPs and the health workforce that we need, but if there's a family with a GP and a teacher, let's say, those skills that are needed in Plymouth with the fantastic opportunities that some of the schools are offering now in Plymouth, how do we really go big on that? So that, I feel very optimistic. With that, we're early days, but I think that will be something that I really want to celebrate when I hope we've achieved that. There's lots of things around that you'll know, many of them linked to the health and wellbeing hubs and social prescribing. So in the not too distant future, just about every practice in Plymouth will have some social prescribing, which is an offer to patients and an offer to the practice workforce there, that if a person's need can be better met by one of the fantastic services that the voluntary sector or another non-health, non-medicalised model. There's some great successes, so that feels a very positive story. Finally, on the care models, we are working with Devon doctors now, and soon there's an offer out to practices. What is it that Devon doctors, with their infrastructure, you'll know that they're the organisation that provides out-of-hours services, out-of-hours GP services in the county. What can they do to offer practices a bit of overflow capacity, if you like, to see patients in care homes on their behalf? So a very proper, all the appropriate governance there, an accessible service for the practice and for patients. Also for telephone triage, as has been offered in Ocean. So some of those are happening. Craig will want to talk to the winter.
So yeah, I think you've had a copy of the winter plan. As you well know, we are a system under pressure, and just a plug as well, we've got CQC in next week as well for our week-long review, so we're all looking forward to that. But we have got a number of initiatives in train at the moment as well, which will start making an impact during the course of the winter. Ones I would absolutely flag out there is the acute assessment unit, including primary care streaming, ambulatory care and frailty now. So that's the relocation of the Robin unit at the front door of Derriford, went live on Monday as well, so that's really positive. We are increasing domiciliary care capacity as well to get more people home first time. Home first is becoming the default philosophy across the system, which is important. And also we're trying to maximise the whole of the bed use really across the city. So we are looking at the Mount Gold site to see what we can do around patient flow. We've also put in additional capacity for the winter as well, for surge when it comes as well. That's both bed-based and domiciliary care as well, for that as well. And I think importantly as well, you referenced earlier as well around prevention and getting information and advice out there to as many people as possible. And we've just put on the bottom there this flyer which we've put out to 70 homes within Plymouth and the Stay Well campaign as well. And it's important that we get as much messages out to people in the city, and that's the Z flyer which has gone out to as many practice people as we can. And there is a big marketing campaign below that, behind that, and DAF's actually helping to publicise that as well.
Yeah.
Impressed. Okay. Sorry? Questions? Mike?
Yeah, go on.
Councillor Sparling first.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Nicola, your governing body is made up of GPs, as I understand it. And I'm delighted that you have Dr. Jones with you here today as well, as he might be able to help us. What would the view of GPs be of the GP crisis in Plymouth broadly?
So I think there's no doubt that things are extremely challenging. Speaking to colleagues, GP colleagues across the city, whilst I agree, I think there are opportunities in new models of care and using the allied health professionals to support new models of care. I think there is a bottom line that there aren't enough GPs in the city. And I think that remains a key issue. So I think speaking to colleagues, things are very challenged across the city, but there is a real will to address that. And I think there are always opportunities that come from crisis, because actually there isn't a choice about whether we change or not. We have to look at new ways of working, which actually is an essential part of our health service evolving. Our populations are changing, the needs of our populations are changing, and so our health service has to evolve to reflect that. So whilst things are extremely challenging, I do think it does lay a strong foundation to look at new ways of working, but things are very, very challenged, yeah.
If I may, well, that's very concerning to hear. You sound very optimistic, though, which is perhaps not shared on this panel at this moment on time. But if I may just continue, your improvement plan, Nicola, for primary care in our city that we've just been through there seems to take a medium-term approach. It will necessarily take time to embed and to come online, thinking of recruitment, for example. So in the meantime, and Craig did touch on this in respect of winter specifically, but in the meantime, in the areas of greater challenge, what actions or interventions do you think would immediately help residents get access to primary care services? Because there is considerable concern out there.
I think we've probably spoken of the key ones. If we start with the population, some people in the population are really clear about where to go. They feel confident in navigating, as we would say, our health and care system. That's not true for a segment, I don't know the stats, but you know, there will be a significant number of people who don't feel confident in getting to what they end up perceiving as the right place. So how are we helping with generic communications being posted out to people in line with the national communications? That's really important, so there's consistent messages. We're working closely with GP practices, with community pharmacies, increasingly with the wider
assets in Plymouth, libraries, etc., to trying to get those consistent messages out to people. So that's where I would start, is try to get people to the right place the first time as we deem it. We are putting Mark spoke, there's some funding, some immediate funding going out to practices to better enable them to stay or become resilient. We've also put out some funding to groups of practices to enable them to make more, to be clear about their plan and get a better progress in terms of working at scale and the benefits that that brings. I then talk about our other providers. So if I go back to the primary care partnership, we're starting the first meeting of this in December, and this is where there are so many organisations locally who have a responsibility and or interest in primary care. So so we've got the hospital meeting with us regularly around primary care. We've got Live Well meeting with us regularly, public health and so on, the Academic Health Science Network, the statutory representative committees, and we are asking those questions. What is it that we can in the short term do to shift some resource? So how are we enabling the workforce to they may be employed by whichever organisation, but to be more flexible in terms of working and bringing services together. We could probably do a whole list of things, and David wants to come in.
I mean, I guess I build on that. So previously I worked for a year and a half in Erney Settle, I worked for 3 years in St Budo, and I work in a different part of the city now. And I think that there's quite a bit of work around social prescribing. So in other words, and a big part of that is signposting to non-clinical services. And in other areas of the country that have done that, up in Bristol and up in Rotherham, there has been a demonstrated impact both on people's quality of life, anxiety and depression levels, but also their use of general practice, their GP practices and the emergency department as well. And just to bring that to life, I mean, I'm sure we will all recognise the things that make us feel well are connecting with others, being active, learning new skills and things like that, which are all things which perhaps traditionally might not have been thought of within the health service. Now, I know, having worked in those areas, those are factors that pay a huge burden on people in those areas. So the social prescribing is about trying to support people in each of those areas to try and improve their well-being. But as a consequence of that, in areas that it's been tried, that has had an improved impact in terms of use of, or a reduction in the use of general practice services. Because I think this is about preserving general practice services for providing care for those people who absolutely, well, those people do need it, but everyone needs it, but nevertheless, who are going to get the most value from that. So that's one practical example of something that there's been a procurement exercise around recently, which I believe has just gone through, and we are working with GP practices right now to improve that link between GP services. And in my experience, a number of people use GP services as signpost to signpost because, frankly, as a member of the public, it is a complicated set of services out there to navigate. And at the point of crisis, where do you go to access service X or service Y? So that's one example of something that is going live imminently.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so essentially you're
Mike,
saying communication,
Mike,
joined up thinking
Mike,
of resources.
I think you've had your chance. Ian.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of, if I may, a couple of points I'd like to raise. One is obviously I'd welcome all your opinions on our problems and failings with transfer of care from Derriford Hospital, what the impact of a lack of GPs has on that. I know it's not that simple, but I do think I would welcome your views on that because I think it's very important. And the other point I think is over time, I mean, Craig's been involved in this fully. Integration seems to have worked to improve the care of people. So I would welcome your views, and you may refuse to give these views, on if NHS funding was integrated in our CCG. For my money, that means there would be a democratic responsibility because CCGs have a board and a governance, and council services that have a board and a governance. So I would welcome your views on whether that would make sense, because it appears to me more integration improves services for people. So I think that money would sit very comfortable in CCG, who've got the expertise to give a local service for Plymouth in particular, but over the wider area. So if I may, those two questions, please.
So in terms of the first question, Councillor Tuffin, around discharges, I don't think here the lack of primary care provision necessarily has an impact on delayed transfers of care. I think it's fair to say. If you look at our assessment delays, our delays, they are mostly around assessments and then getting the appropriate package of care. So I think that's fair to say. Where there is an impact is around the D2A pathway, discharge to assess pathway in care homes, and that's taken some work on that as well to make sure that we've got the right primary care support wrapped around those care homes. So Daff can talk about that. In terms of your second point, I think within the presentation we absolutely signalled that there is a strategic ambition, and I think it is shared by NHSC, that we do move towards delegated commissioning at some point in the future. Now, there's a number of hurdle criteria that we would need to go through, but I think that's absolutely the aspiration. We remain committed to that one system, one budget. Councillor Tuffin, did you just want to pick up on the D2A?
Sure. So the philosophy behind discharge to assess is as soon as someone is deemed medically fit, as deemed by the hospital consultant, whether they have ongoing therapy needs, so they need some rehabilitation, for example, that's then delivered in a community setting. I think one of the things that was raised earlier, which is absolutely correct, is that's all well and good, but you need to have sufficient manpower capacity to be able to deliver that. Now, there's no doubt, we'll take someone that's been in Derriford Hospital, let's say, for 2 weeks, and the hospital consultant is happy for that person to be discharged from hospital. Now, often what happens is if they're not deemed to be safe to go back to their own usual home environment, back to their own home, because of nighttime needs or a variety of reasons, they will often go into a temporary residential or nursing home environment. Now, frequently, that's out with their usual GP's catchment area, so they will fall under the care of a new GP, which might be myself, for example. So these are people who are incredibly complex. They have multiple needs, often nearing the end of life is the common scenario, who the GP whose care that they fall under might not have ever met them previously. So they're complicated, they're at high risk of being admitted back into hospital. So from a patient care perspective, having that model doesn't work particularly well. From an urgent care system point of view, that doesn't work well because the first that people know about them is when they're experiencing crisis. And one of the things that doesn't support good decision making is not knowing the person and having to make a decision in a hurry. So, and then the final bit is for our GP colleagues. So we've heard about how push GP services are. These are people that need a lot of care input. And the best care is proactive care, so spending time learning about the individual, learning about what their end-of-life care needs might be, for example. So there are a number of issues for these people who are in a residential or nursing home out with their own usual GP catchment area. So we are speaking to Devon, what are we doing about this? Well, we are speaking to colleagues within Devon Doctors about them taking over the medical care for those patients, providing a more proactive service, which would be about seeing them within 24 hours of being discharged from hospital, having a plan for those people, and that would be a service that would be provided across all the residential and nursing homes for people that have been discharged from hospital. So I think there are a number of benefits that will bring both to GP practices, to patient citizens within this city, to GP practices as well. And I think that's a really, really important measure for citizens, for the urgent care system, but also for GP practices as well. And I'm happy to answer any specific questions about that because I could talk all day about it.
Thank you.
So, is it fair to say then that integrated commissioning is saving the bacon of the NHS England, given their inability to commission GP services? I won't expect an answer, Craig. I really won't.
I think we're absolutely all part of the same issue and trying to work to solve a really complex issue. And I think one thing we've learned on the integration journey is we are part of a system and we need to work beyond organisational boundaries. So we don't see it as NHSE and CCG, we see it as absolutely collaborating and working in the best interest of the patients, and that's at the heart of what we do.
Good, thanks. David?
Thank you, Chair. Craig, I've already mentioned to Mark Proctor regarding my concerns over the recruitment and retention of GPs in Plymouth itself. And I think Councillor Sparkling was quite right when he said it's in a crisis. I believe it is. And I know that Daffy just mentioned that we have a problem in Plymouth itself with GPs, but I'm sure that also applies to domiciliary care. Daffy, I don't know whether you're speaking on behalf of the governing body, or because we know the governing body is made up of GPs. What do you think their view of the primary care service in Plymouth is? Do they think it's in a crisis?
So I don't sit on the governing body, so I couldn't speak for them. I think what I would say from the discussions and the meetings I've had with colleagues from the east and the north of Devon and Torbay, I think it's widely recognised that the GP situation in the city of Plymouth is a key risk across Devon. So I think that is something that I do hear. So it is recognised as being something that is a key issue across Devon. I think that's probably all I can say, really.
So my question to Craig then really is, how is the STP addressing the problem?
I think, as Mark outlined, some of the key measures we're doing across the whole system in terms of prioritising this as a work stream and the strategy that Mark's brought forwards as well. I absolutely think, same as Daffyd, is that primary care is absolutely challenging. You can see that, and we're absolutely all cited on that. But there's also to put out there as well, we do have some really pockets of good practice within the city, and we have got a primary care home initiative which is absolutely recommended as good practice. So for me, we should be absolutely maximising those pockets of opportunity where we can and start really building on that as well. And I think, sorry.
Thank you, Craig. So we know there's a problem, crisis in Plymouth. So what changes do you think could we make immediately to help residents access to primary care services immediately?
So I think Nicola's covered some of the ground already in terms of her initial answer around making sure that we've absolutely get people in the right place, and the greater collaboration between the agencies as well. I think those are the short-term measures we've put in place. We're also fostering greater collaboration as well across the board, making best use of community pharmacy and those things as well. So it's making best use of the resources we've got at the moment, Councillor James, because we can't just magic up resources. So it's absolutely making sure that all those services, all those people are networked in, and we get them to the appropriate places. So cross-organisational working has to become more and more the norm.
Thank you. Councillor Carson.
Thank you, Chair. I think most of us on this panel are involved in the voluntary sector, and appreciate the constraints that it has on with the resource and finance. How much burden do you think that you're going to put on that sector by signposting the needs of the residents of Plymouth?
I don't see it as a burden at all, Councillor Carson. I see it, we will be commissioning those services through contracts, and the message I get back from the voluntary and community sector is they want to do more. Absolutely, that's the key message. We've got a good, vibrant voluntary and community sector out there, and the services that Nicola talked around through social prescribing, they will be provided through the voluntary and community sector, and they will be funded by the local authority as well regarding some of the additional money. So I see them as a key system partner.
Thank you, Craig. That's good to hear. That so there is funding available to help the service then.
Yeah, we've utilised some of the additional adult social care funding which came down to absolutely support some of these initiatives as well. And I think the board's scrutiny's had that plan in the past as well, but that feels to us to be a good use of that additional funding as well.
I think it's probably essential to make sure that whatever the contracts are, that they are monitored well to make sure that the operators are meeting their targets, isn't it? I think that's the secret of a good contract there. Dr. Mahoney.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to hear about the initiative for discharged complex patients. It's long been talked about, and I think that'll help a lot. Question is, could someone elaborate a bit on the alliances that you've got on this paper? I mean, some of them are bigger practices, but some of them are alliances. How is it working? What is the aim of it?
So, nationally and locally, there is a belief that general practice and wider primary care working at scale brings around more, in the end, brings more resilience and opportunity, and is therefore something to be progressed. So for Plymouth and our locality, including South Hams and West Devon, a number of practices were already forming themselves. This isn't necessarily around contractual merger and therefore becoming a larger entity. These are sometimes quite loose arrangements whereby practices who know each other, have some commonality, have a trusting relationship across them, come together to work on a number of things. So it might be some very practical, they might share with each other new and different workforce models where practices are taking pharmacists or emergency care practitioners, that kind of thing. They might look at some infrastructure together. They might look at developing an acute care hub together. Even perhaps repeat prescribing hubs isn't something that's on the plan, but could be something that could bring, and repeat prescribing being such a big workload for practices, that's the sort of thing that done really efficiently, back office type thing, is maybe better for the patient in some areas. So we've encouraged practices to come together. So what we've got at the moment is 4 groups. I use that very generic term, groups of practices. In terms of Sound Health Alliance is a group covering about 17 practices, about a total registered population of about 126,000, going from sort of the north around to the west and then the southwest of the city. Many of the practices with the more deprived populations, they're working together. Then we've got Drake that goes from north down to south, and Parfield, a group that has a number of buildings across, and then Beacon in Plimpton and Ivybridge, and then with Plimpstock. So we've got them together. They had formed a collaborative board trying to strengthen the voice of general practice in the beginning. There's a recognition that the importance and the role and the opportunity and the need, all of those sort of things of general practice perhaps hasn't been as prevalent in strategic STP type conversations as would be good enough. So it's about trying to improve those things. We've recently offered some funding out to those groups to enable them to take their next steps, and we work collaboratively with them. So I'm a commissioner. I feel like I'm doing quite a different type of role that I have done in the past. It is very much about working with the practices. So those lines of communication are open. What are the priorities? What are the needs? Making sure that we've got that trust, that openness to really talk, openly in a non-threatening environment about what could help, and bringing in, as I said, those other organisations. So some of those you will see different, the result of some of the groups at some times will be about different models of care that are offered to people. In other occasions, it's going to be about them working together and collaboratively to try and so we're fairly early on in our development of those, but certainly practices are responding quite well.
Thank you.
Fine, right, just about at the end. Nicola, you were saying about working with Judith and her team about opportunities, etc. What contact have you made with the economic development team? Because obviously they look at attracting people. All right, that's a different, in a different perspective, but there's got to be lessons that they've learned that are useful there. So have you made contact with Dave Drathin and his team?
I believe one of his team was in a meeting that we had earlier in the week. So it's very early days. There felt like a really good conversation with intent at the moment. It felt like there was the mutual support that was going to be offered. It felt such an obvious thing really for us to really bring. There was already some health involvement in the brochure, etc., that's produced for Plymouth to better market Plymouth across the country. We're going to update the wording in there, some positive, more accurate things around general practice, about some of the new opportunities, really trying, I know there's some anecdote, but there have been some GPs who have started working in Plymouth on a temporary basis from out of area. I'm just talking anecdotally, but sometimes the anecdote is helpful. And they've come and they've said, actually, we were expecting things to be really hard. Actually, they're not as bad as we thought. And actually, we're really enjoying working in Plymouth. So how do we bottle that and get those positive messages out to people? Plymouth is such a fantastic place to live and work. Let's make that more known. So we're early days, but I think over the next few weeks, it's really going to come together. I
think we have to work together for the best, don't we, from that? And then, Craig, just looking at the winter pressures concerns, norovirus and obviously flu jabs as well for care staff, patients, etc. How are we doing with that? Are we getting positive responses back from care staff to say, yes, they are getting their flu jabs?
I don't know if Ruth got the data, but there certainly feels a positive engagement campaign from the care homes. They always embrace it really well, but I'm sure Ruth will cover that off as well.
Well, thank you very much, the three of you, for coming along this afternoon. We do appreciate it. And obviously we'll be forming some recommendations from this, and we'll be sharing that with you. But thank you for joining some of the dots together. Ruth, your turn. Ruth, thank you for joining us, as I say, and I think really we want to see from the public health perspective what's the implications for public health and with when these GP surgeries are giving less of a service than what they could do and the closures. How are you sort of seeing how does that fit in and with the Plymouth plan, etc.?
I think I wanted to just start off by saying that I've been working very closely with the people that you've already heard from. As you're very well aware, we do work as a system. The integrated health and wellbeing system budget doesn't quite include primary care at this stage, but we are all trying to work together. And the reason why we're trying to work together is because we know there are challenges. We recognise that there are challenges across the health outcomes that we get and across the delivery of some of the services. And so that is recognised, and that's what we are trying to tackle. I hope you've heard in sufficient detail that there's sort of three streams of work to do around that, isn't there? There's getting more GPs into practice, into Plymouth, and the range of work that's going on around that, you will have heard most of it. I just wanted to add things like I wrote a letter of support recently with the medical school. They are trying to get more people into the medical school to be trained. We're trying to increase the exposure that medical students have to understanding what primary care is like in deprived areas. We're doing work around that. There's something then around helping practices to work together to make the most of the staff that they have and to reorganise, regroup, do things differently, and you've heard about that. And then the third thing is around wrapping the services that we have around as a system so that it isn't just primary care. We are looking at that whole system, and things like the health and wellbeing hubs form a part of that. So going back to the issue of, there's a couple of points there, isn't there? There's one point that was made earlier on was around, it feels as if the practices that seem to be struggling are in those more deprived areas. Yes, I think that's a really valid issue. It's a real concern. And I don't believe that we are just seeing that in Plymouth. I think this is being seen nationally. I think there is an acknowledgement that practices in more deprived areas with more deprived populations are struggling to deliver the vast amount of work that they need to do to support those populations. The funding for general practice comes from the Cahill formula, and this was based on looking at the typical primary care time that was spent with populations of patients, I think around 20 years ago, and then modelled to try to say, how do we predict the amount of time that, say, a GP needs to spend with their patients? And there's been a lot of discussion around how well that reflects not just deprivation, but primary care now, as opposed to primary care 20 years ago. We know that people are living a lot longer, and we know that they're living longer with chronic illnesses. We also know that in our deprived areas, people develop those illnesses at a much earlier stage. And we also know those people have many complexities around their social environment as well as their health, and obviously all of that interacts and impacts on their health. So I think there is a question about whether the funding for practices in our more deprived areas is sufficient. And of course, how do we attract people to work in those deprived areas? And there's a balance here, because we do want to be encouraging people to relish the challenges that gives them. It does bring a sort of a different approach, or require a different approach and sets of skills. And we don't want to be putting people off by telling them just how hard it is all the time. So there is a challenge there. I think there is a question of whether they're getting adequate funding. And one piece of work that we have been able to do as a system, which I think it is small amounts of money, but it's helpful, was look at, there was a pot of money of around £100,000 that we had a little bit of free rein to say, where do we think, what practices do we think might need some support and might benefit from that funding? And we specifically looked there about those practices who have the most patients in the most deprived 10%, and managed to get that money out to practices. And this was across the CCG, but as you can imagine, I think all of the money, but certainly the vast majority of the money came directly to Plymouth. As I say, it's small amounts of money, but we are trying as a system to recognise that is indeed an impact. So that's my sense is that the Cahill formula needs to be updated. There's lots of discussion around that with the BMA and NHS England, and we understand that an updated formula should be on its way in the near future. So I don't yet know what that will look like, but the reports that I've seen recently have said that they also think there should be a higher weighting or more account taken of deprivation. So I'd welcome that when it comes through. In terms of what the question you asked around what has the specific problems in primary care in Plymouth, what effect has that had? As I say, we know that they have tended to affect the more deprived areas of the city, and we know that those are the people that we would like to be able to give the most support to. And so it is worrying when we have to disrupt any element of what the care that they're used to receiving. However, there have been efforts made to try to handle that in the best way, and it is important to note that there haven't been, it isn't that primary care has been totally withdrawn from that population, so we do need to remember that. However, I'm sure that there has been confusing messages for people, there's been conflicting information as to what they should do, and there will have been a lack of understanding as to where they can access services. And obviously, in particular with Ocean, there has been a reduction in the service that was offered for a period over that couple of months where constraints on the GP practice was very tight. So we do know that. What we've seen arise from that, we have seen people changing their behaviour a little, and although it's difficult to sort of completely attribute, there certainly have been increases in attendances at PHNT and at the minor injuries unit from patients. Something like overall there's been an increase across the Western locality, and if you break it down to just Ocean Health patients, it really does look like there's been an increase. So people have been accessing care in different ways, and obviously it's appropriate for them to do that if they can't access it through their GP. There have been other things put in place through Devon Docs, etc., to try to provide that primary care. In terms of whether there's harm being caused or has been caused, it is almost impossible to tell. I've looked at the literature, and the only comparisons you have of what does primary care do and how well does primary care reduce harm to patients is based on looking at models across different countries, and the American system just has no relationship to our own system because they don't have those other services in place. So I think to sum up that, there's a concern, obviously. I don't have any clear evidence that there has been a problem, but I can say that the system as a whole are very aware of the risk and have been trying to manage that, and hope, I am sure, we will be pushing to bear that in mind in the future. And I know that isn't as positive as I'd like to be, but there are challenges.
Thank you. Dr. Mahoney.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ruth, for your presentation. I think we all know that year on, we've been having reduction in public health settlement from the government. We recognise that, and we don't agree with it at all, obviously. We need more money in public health. Has that affected your ability to assist the primary care settings? And I'm talking particularly around areas of deprivation, the inequalities between the deprived areas and more affluent areas in Plymouth. Has that affected delivery of service from your point of view?
There is always more that you could do if you had more money to do it. So that's a given. In terms of the specific issue around primary care, the public health budget doesn't really contribute greatly to that in terms of that resource. I think that the system has tried to respond to put some additional resources in. So yes, there is all. It's a really difficult question. There is always more that can be done if we did have more funding. But I can't say that there's a direct correlation between the public health grant and primary care issues that we're facing at the moment. Some of the extra things that we're trying to do, and where more money would obviously be really helpful, is this bit of trying to provide the wraparound services that support primary care. My colleagues have mentioned the idea of health and wellbeing hubs that would support this, and social prescribing, etc. And at the moment, we're very lucky that some money is being found across the system budget to support with that. You know, that money is very precious in a very resource constrained area.
Okay. The finances you put into the CCG, do you feel that Plymouth is getting a fair return for the money that you're putting in?
Yes, I do. I think probably the breadth of what public health's been able to achieve has been broadened by the Integrated Health and Wellbeing Fund. So the money that we put in is in the Plymouth part of the Integrated Health and Wellbeing Fund. So that money is absolutely within Plymouth. But by integrating the funds, we've had the ability to look across a wider range of services and of funding. So looking at the wellbeing strategy, there are other things that fall under that I'm not funding, but that public health have a remit over. So the integration has broadened the ability to look at public health and to tackle inequalities.
Thank you. Sue?
My question follows on quite nicely, I think. Listening to the previous presenters, and I know funding is an issue, but it also sounds like that funding isn't an issue, because there is definitely money in the system to pump Prime, either voluntary or other organisations, to help in that support. So my question is, I don't think in this case we can use funding as an excuse for not doing something, because using sort of some of the networks that you talk about in here to address some of our local priorities, there is stuff that we can do about healthy eating, about smoking, about drugs, about alcohol, about exercise, about supporting low-level mental health needs. And I just wondered, what's the public health role in that, in identifying the gaps in the communities like Barnbarton, which haven't got a full wraparound service, where all those things would directly affect people's lives and stop them accessing the GPs in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. The ideal would be to support people so that their need for GP primary care is vastly reduced. So that's what Thrive Plymouth is trying to do. So as you'll know, this is our campaign across the city to tackle health inequalities through looking at the factors that influence people's behaviour. We've just launched Year 4, which is looking at well-being, mental well-being in particular, which is one of those things that makes a big difference to the behaviours that people do exhibit. So through Thrive Plymouth, we are working really closely with the community and voluntary sector. And part of that whole well-being strategy and support around that goes from Thrive Plymouth and bringing that into communities through well-being hubs. So we are addressing that. We're really well aware of the areas where which obviously relate very closely to deprivation, where we do have those behaviours that we know will influence people's health in the long run, and we are trying to tackle that through a variety of sources, and some of that is working with funded providers, and some of it is helping to rally the troops, if you like, and make sure that everybody that's involved in those communities knows what we're trying to do and why, and helps to play a part in that.
Chair, just as I think we might want to look at that in the future to see what sort of, I don't like to use return on investment, but I mean, for things like mental health, if we can put more low-level professional care into communities, we're going to get a much quicker feedback when that's one of the key issues in deprived wards.
That's the tough in.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Ruth. On a similar line, I'm aware the funding for public health's been cut and cut. But is there any way we can collate the impact that those cuts have on? Because I've always believed the preventative agenda would feed into all this debate we're having today about lack of services. And is there any way we can look at the false economy of making cuts in public health, which affect health in this city, and how we kind of understand that? Because I understand the principle, but I don't understand the impact, because obviously it's going to have a huge impact, because if we prevent people getting ill, we're saving so much money. And you know, the fact that your service has been cut in the past just seems a really silly way to be serving the people of Plymouth.
Yes, thank you for that. That's exactly true. The more prevention that we can do, the more proportion that we of our total funding that we can be spending on prevention, then the better those outcomes are likely to be. And we do recognise that across the system. I can very, very happily bring you some papers on how we think that could work more. There's some very good work done that exactly does look at return on investment and looks at, you know, if you stop one person from smoking, what do you do? What impact does that have on healthcare costs and on those wider costs to society? So if that would be a way to address it, if I perhaps circulate a paper to the members of this group, I'd be very happy to talk through that. But there is a clear return on investment, and that is why through our integrated health and wellbeing, we have been very clear that we want to continue the spend on prevention, at least the proportion that's spent on prevention, and focus on that. So, and I do have to add that, as you heard, some of the funding that you've heard that will support prevention is not coming directly from the public health budget. So the integrated system is working in that sense. But obviously, the cuts that we have had to public health have made that total budget shrink. And there are certainly opportunities where you would be saying, I mean, one of the key things that we know is that giving children the very best start in life is incredibly valuable to the development of their future and of their eventual health and well-being. If we had more money, then, you know, I'm sure there would be many things we could invest in around children that would help to fulfil that aim. So I can bring you something along that lines.
Thank you, Ruth. And it goes without saying that, you know, the Thrive stuff that you do is amazing, and all the other work that public health do, because you are doing an immense amount of work, so it's appreciated.
Ruth, within your directorate, you have taxi licensing, don't you? And one of my concerns is we're going to be getting voluntary services to be helping, you know, to look at alternative ways of getting people's health sort of looked at. All I can say is a lot of people with the heavy electric wheelchairs are finding a great deal of a problem getting taxis. And I think if we're going to be asking people to be going to various things, that needs to be one thing that we could look at as a council to help that process. Certainly, as I say, there's concerns. So I think it's something that we need to think of. You know, are we facilitating people getting to places?
I think one of the advantages of public health having a wider directorate than just public health and having that engagement with a range of other services is that we can look for the public health benefits in each of those other services, and that sounds like an excellent example of something I need to do some work on, so thank you for that piece of information. I'll take that away.
Can I say thank you very much for coming along this afternoon, and we know full well that you won't get away from us for very long. We'll be wanting you back for something else, and I believe you're coming to the December's meeting about the health and wellbeing hubs, so that'll be good to see that. Thank you very much indeed. Karen, the time is yours. Now, I do apologise for us running late. We should have realised that this would happen and given some extra time, so I'm sorry about this. If you'd like to introduce yourselves and whatever you need to say, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm Karen Marcellino. I manage the Healthwatch Plymouth service. This is my colleague, Tony. He's the Deputy Manager at Healthwatch in Plymouth, so thank you for inviting us along today. We haven't prepared a report or a presentation or a spreadsheet or data of any sort, really, because we've heard lots today about contracts and money and performance and regulation, and actually we'd like to talk a little bit about people. Because that's the basis of our work, and I think a lot of the work that we do, we lose sight as a system of the end user and ultimately what their experience of improving outcomes are. So I'll just give you a kind of a brief whistle-stop tour of what we've been doing around primary care over the last 12 months. So we've carried out some engagement with patients of surgeries that were involved in the potential closure and the recommissioning that we met previously around. We gathered some of their views. We were quite vocal with NHS England's engagement process around that, and I just want to feed back to the panel that actually since that piece of work, the surgeries that have closed since, the engagement of patients that would be affected by that has improved dramatically. And I think it's important for us to recognise that, because what we want to make sure within Health Watch is that people have the option to be involved and engaged and share their views if they want to, but recognise that actually people may not want to do that. And that is a piece of work that has improved dramatically over that time. We've also carried out a small piece of engagement around accessing a GP, whether that be through a face-to-face appointment or being able to gain contact with your GP should you need it. It was a very small, time-limited piece of work. It wasn't something that we put all of our service capacity into, so it could be a bigger piece of work should we feel that we've got the resource to do that. But we published earlier this year a report around GP access, and we can talk around some of the findings of that if you haven't already seen it. We did make some recommendations in that around, particularly around Ocean Health, and how that service was affecting patient experience, because fundamentally that's what we're here to do, reflects the patient experience. Unfortunately, that situation came to a head before we were able to work with Ocean to look at addressing any of those issues. We are currently carrying out a piece of engagement around the callback or triage system that has been implemented in many surgeries, and it's too early really for us to look at that data to say categorically what the results of that are, but we have got some of those themes and trends that are coming out of that with us today. And interestingly, I think the things that are really showing are, it's not necessarily that local people disagree with a callback or triage system, it's that they didn't know it was going to be implemented and they didn't know how it would affect them particularly. There seems to be, and it's early days, really early days, because we're just starting this piece of work now. This was scheduled for us to look at again following our last report, to start in December, but we're starting to see some trend that maybe some of the larger federations, alliances, groups that we've heard about today, the patient experience is starting to not reflect as positively as those standalone surgeries. So that's an initial piece of work for us to have a look at. And I stress that is early days, because that is something that we're just starting to see come out now. So we've also obviously been working alongside Councillor Aspinall in the Western Locality Overview Group, alongside NHS England, looking at some of the challenges that there are around GP recruitment, contract handback, and how patients can be involved in that. I think interestingly for us, since April, we've received 253 pieces of individual feedback around GP surgeries. That's bang up to date now. 155 of those have been positive. So there is quite a sway there towards a positive experience of GPs. What most of those are saying to us is, once you are able to get an appointment, the service is good, and we get the service we need, and we get the outcome we want. The majority of the negative feedback is telling us that we can't get an appointment to start with to be able to experience the service that is then provided. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. We haven't received any feedback regarding the services that were previously Ocean Health, now Access Health, since mid-August. So that is a positive as far as we're concerned, because actually we had a lot of feedback that was finding its way through our system and through our engagement events prior to that. And there are some surgeries in the city where all of the feedback that we have received is completely positive. There is nothing negative there at all. So I think there is some pockets of practice that we can look at. Overwhelmingly, what local people are telling us are they're not able to get through on the telephone to get a GP appointment. If they do get through on the telephone to get an appointment, then they're having a long conversation with what the public deem as a receptionist. I can't clarify it is a receptionist. We don't know who's been spoken to in every case. But local people are concerned about that. They're concerned about the confidentiality issues of a receptionist that sat on a reception desk, taking all of those details when patients are queuing that can be overheard. They're concerned that maybe the support and the training that allows that person to make a decision of whether that's urgent or non-urgent may not be sufficient. So further work around that might be something that we look at. Anything you want to add? I'll lose my voice.
Yeah, I think from looking at the data and that and talking to people, one thing that's coming out to me is this communication aspect. So when something changes in the system, either a practice decides to change something or the system changes something, patients aren't kept abreast of it. And it seems that we put it on a website and expect patients to read it. And it's not going to happen, because we use a website because we want to use it. So if we want to know some news and we want to know it now, we go to a news website. We may only go to our GP surgery if we want to use it there and then, so we're not aware that a process has changed. So there's got to be a better mechanism or a better understanding of that mechanism of how we communicate change to patients of a particular practice or of a group of practices, so that they are informed. Because recently, when Crown Hill surgery became part of the Pathfield group, the feedback has turned negative, and it's turned negative because it's viewed, since the merger of those, that it's more difficult to get an appointment, the service being provided isn't very good, and people aren't happy, and that's from the Crown Hill practice itself. So what's happened there with that merger and how things have changed and how you book an appointment or how you get to see a GP or even how you do a repeat prescription hasn't filtered through, and that's where a lot of the, I think, negative feedback is coming from, because people aren't aware of those system changes.
Thank you for that. Just your comments about people experience of going and the reception desk, etc. I suppose we have to think really these days about the design of reception desks. I mean, when a lot of these practices were built, confidentiality wasn't one of those things that a lot of people were concerned about, isn't it, really? And that would be interesting to find out if that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, we capture the feedback that local people are sharing with us, but obviously at the time we have more conversation with them to be able to delve a little deeper as to what some of these issues are. And you're absolutely right, actually. Some of these buildings are considerably older, and although we might have privacy lines installed, a privacy line, you know, gives somebody privacy to stand back, but actually if you have staff members that are answering the telephone, repeating back to people names, dates of birth, what conditions they want to be seen about, and discussing whether that's urgent, their next door neighbour may be the next person in the queue that's wanting to book that appointment. And there are quite a few people that have raised a concern with us around that. I think the only other thing that I would add is that we've heard a lot around preventative healthcare and proactive approaches to well-being from patients. We're also hearing that actually some patients that share their experiences with us, one of them is here and I'll read that to you. I went to the pharmacy about my daughter yesterday, was told that she would probably need antibiotics. So I rang my surgery at 8:30 and I couldn't get through. Walked to the surgery, I was there at 8:40, the receptionist told me they have no appointments and they've advised me to take my daughter to the minor injury unit. That person is in a PL6 postcode, so their surgery would be in the real north of the city, and they have been advised to travel to the minor injuries unit at the Cumberland Centre.
As I used to get on my report, we need to do better. Thank you. Right, Councillor Tuffin? I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you. The callback system, I've had generally out and about, people talk to me, say, oh, I went to see the doctor and he phoned me. And there's a concern there because, particularly in the poor areas, many people have a complex need and they go and see their doctor because they may be depressed. They may be depressed for very good reasons. Unemployment, poverty, not enough money to last a week. Now, seeing a doctor might draw that out. And I know doctors are very... haven't got a great deal of time to draw out these things, but it's a real concern that a phone call is going to result in probably one problem being discussed. I'm feeling a bit down, and you know I respect GPs, and they would push it perhaps a bit further. But I have a real concern that the phone back system is failing people, particularly people with the complex needs that need to be drawn out. Have you any evidence to say that's happening?
I think it's difficult as a health watch for us to be able to evidence whether a system works or doesn't work because we aren't clinically trained to assess it. So that would be my first point. I can share what people are sharing with us, which is very similar concerns around how long it might take to have a callback, because they're not always aware when they've requested that callback whether they are classed as urgent or non-urgent. So actually for some people that request a callback at 8:10 in the morning, that might be gone 6 at night that they received that call. So there are people within that complex needs group that would find that quite a challenging circumstance. I think the time element around a GP callback, from the people that we've spoken to, that doesn't appear to be an issue. In fact, I probably flip it and say it's quite the opposite. They feel they have more time to talk on the telephone than they would in an appointment in the surgery, because there isn't a queue of people that are visually waiting outside, and they have to keep that to a very short appointment time. So the feedback that we have when they have had the callback is that it works. It's getting through the initial system to obtain it that appears to be the barrier.
Following that up, and I should also think it depends on who phones them back, whether it's the GP, the practice nurse, another, and I think that that's probably a part of the satisfaction with the call as well, isn't it? David?
Thank you, Chair. Tony, you made a very valid point in actual fact that changes in a practice can happen without patients being involved or informed about it, and that's quite a valid thing you've said there. But there are many practices which have patient participation groups. That's where the patients, as you know, work with the practices to make sure there's a better delivery of service. And when that happens, if there is a change in that service, then patients are notified. I just wondered what sort of communication you have with patient participation groups.
We've had communication with some groups before, and we've actually gone and given presentations about the work of Health Watch to those patient participation groups. Sometimes we've tried to get in and we haven't been able to get in, and I think from my point of view, and not a Health Watch point of view, but from my point of view, it depends how that patient participation group has been set up by the surgery. So those that are truly active with the surgery, I think, are great and more receptive, and we have some communication with. Those patient participation groups that have been set up almost as a bit of a fundraiser and nothing else, it's a bit difficult then trying to get in, but that's no different in a way with us trying to access some of the GP surgeries to actually go in and talk either to the practice manager or to hold what we would term an engagement event in the surgery and talk to patients in the waiting room about experiences. Some are very open about us coming in. Others are a bit more, shall we say, sceptical in a way and offhandish because they don't see the benefit and won't have that initial conversation about why we're going in and what we can actually provide to them in terms of giving the view of their patient group about the service that they're providing.
Can I just...
Sorry, just I'll come back to you in a minute, Karen. So shouldn't you be perhaps helping patients to be more involved in patient participation groups? Because that is a way forward as I see it.
Yes, certainly. We, you know, when we do talk to patients, we do mention that to them when they have concerns that their surgery would have a patient participation group, and, you know, to be involved that way. So we try and educate the public, if you like, a little bit about patient participation groups and actually getting actively involved. But at the end of the day, you know, it's very difficult after that to ascertain whether they've actually then gone ahead and done that.
I'm just going to give you a bit more information around some of that work we're doing around PPGs, David, because I think it's relevant. So not just in Plymouth, but across the Devon patch, the 3 local health watch, so that's Devon, Plymouth and Torbay, are currently working with both relevant CCGs to look at a piece of work with PPGs across the whole of Devon to make that more consistent, because it is hit and miss across the patch from surgery to surgery and area to area. So we're looking at how local people can be more involved in that, but also how organisations such as ourselves and such as the CCG can support PPGs actually to be more active and to be more effective.
Councillor Bridgman.
Karen's kind of answered my question, because I was going to just say, you mentioned one surgery had no complaints, they were doing really well. I just wondered if you were sharing all the information gathered about best practice, for example, with other surgeries, and are you making recommendations? Is that part of your remit? And do you actually monitor changes? Do you actually go back to that patient sort of a few months later and ask them, has anything improved at all? So I just wanted to know if a bit more, if you could elaborate just a little bit more, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll try and pick them up in order. So the experiences that are shared with us, we collate those together as a view of patient experience at any one time. We aren't a case resolution service, so we don't carry out one-to-one case resolution for people that may see an issue through to the end. That isn't something that it forms part of the Health Watch service. We're also an anonymous service, so actually 99% of people that share their information with us will not share their contact details. So for us to be able to go back and check and see if their situation is resolved or if things have improved as a result of a service change is very difficult. But what we can do is review our data a time period along, if you like, to see if actually those same themes and trends are being shared amongst our engagement work. So we're gathering this data from engagement across the city, but we do a lot of drop-ins in GP practice waiting rooms. So those that are more receptive to working with us, we will hold a drop-in surgery there on a regular basis. People are able to share their feedback about that service, but also across the whole health and social care landscape, because our information is much wider than GP practice alone. That enables us then to build a picture really of what local feeling is, and then we're able to create a report if we feel that's necessary, or we've done a specific targeted piece of work like we did earlier in the year around the access work, or we're then able to feed that into some of those other forums. So the work that we're doing with the STP into the clinical cabinet, the primary care work stream, we're able to feed that into the quality surveillance group. If there are particular issues around quality, we'll be in regular contact with our colleagues in NHS England to make sure that if there are trends that we see coming through around patient experience within particular practices or groups, that we're able to feed that back in for action then to be taken. We've recently done some work with local practices, a couple in mind around particular experiences that have been shared that were more worrying. So if there is something that's more than a theme, more urgent, then we approach that practice directly.
Can I just add to that? Having recently done one of our engagement events in one of the Plymouth surgeries, at the start of that, I had a chat with the practice manager to get her view of what her challenges were. We then conducted that engagement event, gathered the feedback, and I went and did a hot debrief with the practice manager at the end and said, this is what your patients are saying. And it became clear to me at that particular one, as it has at others I've done, that the issue around communication of particular issues or changes of service with that particular patient group isn't happening very well.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, who would be the person or persons to invite you in? Is that something that the practice manager would invite you, or could the PPG, or how would that go?
I think that depends on the work that we're looking to do with that particular provider. So when we've looked at setting our engagement schedule, we've tried to geographically move around the city to make sure that many people have an opportunity, and we will contact providers directly. We've had an alliance contact us to look at doing more work because they want more patient experience. They want to look at patient experience to improve their services. So actually we did a piloted period where we worked with them them working from each of their surgeries to compare what that patient experience was. That was really positive, and actually when we look at patient experience as a whole, their alliance is performing very well in that. So it can be either or. The PPG can invite us in, the provider can invite us in, or we can request it.
Just thinking with Mount Gold Medical Centre now being the two practices there, it might be quite interesting from that perspective. Maddie, you got an additional question?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I just think it's vitally important that you actually really share this information and actually feed back to these surgeries, because, I mean, you mentioned the receptionist, so you should go to minor injuries. I mean, that's completely unacceptable. But, I mean, if you haven't shared that information with that surgery, then they're not going to know about it. So I just think, you know, it's otherwise, what's the point of gathering all this information if you're not actually going to really ram it out there and let people like the CCG, let Dr. Jones know, so when he sits on his panel or whatever, he can actually really push the issues and say, well, this is what's happening. So anyway, thank you. Rant over.
I'll just quickly answer that for you. Absolutely, that is the key to the work that we do. We have a very large evidence bank, but actually it's worth nothing if we don't do anything with it. So what we need to make sure is that we're using the right channels to get the best response for the public. So in those instances, we do contact the practice manager, we do contact the commissioner, and we do then notify other surveillance groups and meetings that we're at that are looking at safety and quality of services to ensure that that isn't becoming a theme and that is acted upon.
Councillor Dan.
You know, sometimes when you listen to the radio, especially the BBC, first thing in the morning, you can almost guarantee that most weeks there's a negative story about the NHS. So I just thought I wanted to get across, and I'm going to do it here when we're talking about patients. Actually, the NHS is a fantastic service. And just to stress that what we're doing here today is to make it better. Because I'm just sitting here thinking, oh my goodness me, you know, because I think I'm going to go back to 80-20. 80% of everything we do really, really well. And it's the 20% that gives us 100% of the headaches, literally. Anyway, so that's just my little, you know, plug for the NHS. But on another thing, it was something you said earlier about callbacks and triage and the system, about implementation and impact. And I don't think this is a question for you, but I'll voice it. It's like this stay well. Would that be Ruth or was it Craig? Right, Sister Jane. So you said it was going to 70,000 households across the parts of the city, but I just wondered, is it actually going through the GP surgeries as well? Because the story you talked about, the receptionist directing somebody directly to either a hospital or A&E, is not an isolated incident. I mean, I can, you know, I know that people, I know that story is repeated time and time again. So there's a real quick impact that we can have by working directly with surgeries, because, you know, really this should be the first point of reference for anybody who is directing a patient anywhere, because it's got all the relevant information on. So that was the first part of the question. And then are you engaged with this to see what the impact of this project has been across the city during the course of the winter? Is the second part of the question.
To the second part of the question then, we aren't directly engaged with that project as yet, but I'm certain that through some of the other forums that we sit on as part of the primary care work that we're doing, that we will become aware of that work and able to feed into it.
Thank you. Dr. Mahoney.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from Councillor Tuffin's question about callbacks and triage, do you think if they're properly run, this is the way forward to actually elicit which patients need to be seen urgently, who can wait, some can be dealt with on the telephone, but many will still need an appointment? Do you think that's better than the receptionist grilling the patients, or those who shout the loudest getting the appointments when they might not be the most needy to be seen? Do you think there is a way forward if it's properly run?
I'm going to be on the fence a little bit with that, because I don't feel best placed myself to say this is the way forward without, you know, that clinical knowledge and training. I can tell you what patients feel is the way forward, which is they want to be able to get access to their GP should they need it, and they want to be able to do that in a timely way. Now, what they're telling us is when they receive that call back, it works very well. It's the initial element of the callback service that appears to be causing people most concern. Now, that may be easily rectified with more public awareness, more promotion around what goes into a GP callback or triage system with those patients. There may be a role for Health Watch in that, there may be a role for public health, CCG and PPGs. But certainly at the moment, that initial first contact, actually getting to speak to somebody to get to the next point of requesting a callback, is the initial problem. The telephone calls to surgeries are extraordinarily high, and sometimes it's taking people over an hour to get through to find out even the callback list is full.
I mean, I accept that, but the out-of-hours service works on a callback and triage system and has done for a while and seems to work very well. So there must be a way forward, perhaps designated telephone lines for people who want callback and triage.
And I think that's the key there for people that want callback and triage. I think what we're hearing from people at the moment is there is one system, which is you will receive a callback, and that doesn't work for all of our population. So, you know, we've heard about some people with more complex needs that are finding themselves in that system where it doesn't always support them in the best way. So I think it's about having a system that is flexible where it needs to be.
Thank you. Councillor Sparling.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's so encouraging to hear that the consultations around potential closures have improved. I think we'll all be quite relieved to hear that. And certainly credit where credit is due. It's good to hear that NHS England have responded to those well-rehearsed concerns. My first question has been answered, but building on your answer to it is my second. The work you do listening to service users is so important, and I think we all commend you for that. But listening and reporting is one thing, and actual improvements following on from that is perhaps quite another. So how receptive do you find commissioners and others to the ideas that you receive and to your reports? Are you encouraged or otherwise by the response you tend to get, and are things going in the right direction in that respect?
I think within Health Watch in Plymouth, and we all operate slightly differently in all the Health Watch across the country, we've always been very positive about our relationship with commissioners. We've always found that actually if you do a piece of work collaboratively, you are going to have more success with that in a much more efficient time frame. Are our messages and reports always popular? No, certainly not, but that doesn't stop us from sharing those. We share the public view. It's not our view, it's not the view of our steering group, it's the view of those people that choose to share those views with us. So for us, there's been a long piece of work around sharing that in the most appropriate way and making sure that the way we are sharing it, whether that be a report, whether that be a formal letter, or actually in a meeting or forum that we attend, we've done that piece of work to make sure that's shared in the most effective way. I think we always find it a challenge to be able to categorise whether our evidence bank and then a subsequent recommendation to a commissioner or provider has resulted ultimately in that change and has been solely responsible for that. I think that isn't just indicative to us, that is something with patient involvement around the country. Yeah, sometimes people are reluctant to say we've made an improvement to this service based on what you told us. But at the end of the day, if the service improves and actually our feedback then takes a dip that, you know, we're not seeing that issue arise, then ultimately the outcome is what we were after anyway.
Councillor James.
Thank you, Jim. Karen, the last time I think you and I met, and Tony, was at Herod House when you were conducting a consultation process on the health and wellbeing hubs. Were you commissioned to do that, and what was the outcome of the consultation process, and where did that information go to?
Okay, yes, that was a separately commissioned piece of work from Plymouth City Council. The final reporting date on that project is tomorrow, and this morning we have sent all of those final neighbourhood reports and characteristic route report to the relevant commissioner for them to be able to move that forward.
And it's coming to scrutiny on the 13th of December. Right, final question just to you both really. Healthwatch was set up, probably about 5 years ago now, isn't it? It must be 5 or 6 years ago. Is there anything about your terms of reference that you would wish us to be thinking needs to be changed to enable you to do your work better? And in what way? If we're thinking about making recommendations, is there anything that we could help with?
No one's ever asked me that before, but actually, do you know, I think we're actually very lucky here in Plymouth with the contract support that we have from the local authority. We're very aware that Healthwatch across the country are struggling financially to deal with a much more challenged health and social care landscape, which is cradle to grave for us, every service that's commissioned within that with public money. So it is a large remit. There isn't a huge amount of funding that's available for local authorities to commission that. So although we have had some funding reductions, actually we have sustained our income much longer than some other Healthwatch, and that is because of the local authority. So I think we are very lucky in that. I think our constant challenge is that there is so much more we'd like to do. There is so much more we can't do because we don't have an infinite resource. We rely heavily on our volunteers, as do many services across the city now, and competition for volunteers that are prepared to dedicate their time, to help others is becoming really difficult. So I guess for us, the only thing that we would look to do is to do more partnership work around those areas that aren't technically within a statutory Healthwatch remit, but in a holistic view of health and well-being have such a great impact.
I thank the two of you for coming along this afternoon. I do appreciate you giving up your time. And obviously we look forward to working with you over the next years or however long before the government changes Healthwatch to something else, but so thank you. And I will see you on the task group, Karen, when we try and help sort these things out. Thank you both very much indeed. David Bierman, come to the table, please. This is in case you forget your name, you see. We are very generous. And again, an apology for us running late. You're probably used to scrutiny committees doing that, so the floor is yours.
Okay, I wanted to take you through a few slides to start with, if that's okay. So I wanted to kick off with some high-level pieces. So actually, community pharmacy hasn't had a review of its strategy since 2008. So this is pre-Lansley, pre the NHS reforms. So clearly there's a bit of a discrepancy between the way we're operating as it's pre the NHS reforms. But we have had an NHS full review in terms of GPs as well as the overall one, and we've had a responding pharmacy full review as well. And within that, there is a clear need to change. And there has been some contract changes over the last year or so with some what was regarded as fairly significant cuts in pharmacy funding, which has resulted in some difficulties. And I think it's worth mentioning that for a couple of factors, really, that we know that Lloyds have recently said they're either going to close or sell 160 of their stores. And also the context it creates in terms of mindsets around whether people want to engage in change and innovation or they become inward-looking. But also it does create some real burning bridge mentality as well. So there's a bit of a two-pronged aspects to that. Also, there's been a Murray report which is talking about how pharmacy needs to move forward, looking at managing long-term conditions, doing more around urgent care, etc. Fairly extensive set of reports which is suggesting we need to be very much more integrated into general practice work and working side by side to improve the care of the population. And I think it's important to mention that actually the South West is recognised as one of the key innovative areas in the country in terms of driving change in pharmacy, around the workforce, around the contracts, around how we use the IT platform, generating new models,
and around how we align to the GP4 view, and in particular to the National Association of Primary Care's view about primary care home, where you've got one in Plymouth, but there's also a whole spread of them from the southwest, and Cornwall's virtually entirely primary care home sites now. So that's the kind of general context. Why do we have a problem? Well, we've got a problem in pharmacy as well, actually, because we have a bit of a lack of capacity for change because of the level of activity we've got around supply. Also, we, along with GPs and nurses and paramedics, have a shortage of pharmacists in the southwest. The difference is, nationally, there isn't a shortage of pharmacists. But we do have one in the southwest, and it gets more problematic as you move from Bristol down to down through the peninsula. There is some estates issues here, not just in pharmacy where obviously as you build more demand, some of the existing premises to get a bit tight for space, but also about how we use the space, how we use our consultation rooms, which actually aren't operated a lot of the day. And so there are some opportunities there in terms of estates, how we might use the pharmacies differently across the whole system. And the other bit is to think about, the vulnerable areas. Yes, some pharmacies are slightly vulnerable at the moment, but it's also thinking about what's the impact of failing pharmacies and practices in terms of creating a domino effect. Because if a practice starts to struggle, it does have a material impact on the pharmacy that it aligns with. And so, all these things need to be thought about. How do they all work as a system, rather than thinking of us as a silo and the practice as a silo? We are definitely a system, and consequences of one are consequences of the other. And the other thing is that lack of financial situation at the moment does create a bit more limited headroom to experiment for people, because not only have they got less cash flow in, they also are getting more angst about wanting to invest in long-term future because they cannot see a long-term strategy / future to invest in. So there's some difficulties around that. And the primary thing, as I'm sure everyone knows, is that demand is growing and growing, and our ability to provide the supply and service that demand is beginning to be more problematic. So how pharmacy can assist? Well, there's various things. These are national things going on. There's some urgent care work happening at the moment, and we particularly in the southwest have got some patient group directives which allow us to do things like UTIs and conjunctivitis and things such as impetigo around patients. And we can obviously do we can obviously do a lot of work around supporting people with their urgent care needs as well. What's happening? Do we move right back? And alongside that, there's been some work around Pharmacy Futures 1 and 2, which just talks about how pharmacies can move on to long-term conditions management, think about how we can do care planning, etc. There's been a significant move of moving pharmacists into general practice, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But that has significantly improved the situation. And there is quite a lot of work going on about how pharmacies can be used in care homes. And we've got a very, very good example of that in Plymouth, where pharmacists are being used to do the majority of the care in those care homes. And we've seen a significant improvement in care as a consequence, largely because of the higher level of time they have to commit to it. National expansion is carrying in diplomas and prescribing courses, and there's a significant self-care and public health agenda as well that we're moving on. But that's really not enough. Locally, we think there's a need for much broader system change, and so we have been doing a lot more work locally than has been done nationally around what's the contract look like, what processes should we be looking at, what competencies do we need? What system change do we want? And we've even started looking at new models. And the first in the country around this is around a demand sink, as I call it. But it's about really how do we try and assist GPs in taking demand out of general practice? How do we stop it even getting to their doors? And there's a real need for us to move to a population and outcome-based approach and away from a supply approach. And within that, a really different workforce model around joint roles, developing training, recruitment, etc. And so the aim is to make pharmacy a key contributor to the sustainability of primary care, both through direct support in the practice and be redesigning community pharmacy to be a key partner in community service provision. All right, and that's to allow pharmacies and the practices to thrive in that new world. So that's what we're trying to do. So I'm just going to run you through these very quickly. So what we're trying to do is that there is some process work being developed whereby we're beginning to think about how do you manage medicines across the whole thing, across organisations. Because we know, actually, if we designed it from the start again, we wouldn't design it like this, would we? And so you look at the organisational boundaries and say, how can we do things slicker? How can we get lean processes into this? Now, it isn't going to be easy, this, at all, because there are lots of governance issues, etc. But there are things, for example, like the way we manage repeat medicines, that if we could put that into a pharmacy and take some of the burden off, to be honest with you, most of the practices would bite your hands off for us to do that. But the difficulties around governance and around the way we're paid and the contracting mechanisms make that quite difficult at this point in time. So we're looking at how we may move towards that scenario, and obviously you need a prescriber, etc., available as well. But we're looking to see, what do we really want to do and how do we make it happen? And if we can do that, we know there are substantial savings and time savings that we can free up to do other things as a consequence. To do some of this, though, we also need to enable it through access to notes so we can read, write, etc. Actually now, having worked on this for a year or so, it looks like the technology is not a major problem anymore. It looks like the major issue is how we're going to deal with information governance and around issues such as that. We think there are solutions to that we're currently working on, but obviously that requires us to work as a collective system to get there. But we think we are quite close to resolving that issue. We're looking at how we change the pharmacy model. So we are nationally leading in this, and we're looking in one part of the city, and I'll talk to you through a bit more about it in a minute, but around where we closed the Saltash Road surgery, there was a need there to try and continue with as much provision in that locality as possible. So NHS England have been really, really positive locally in supporting us in that and been looking at doing something quite radical about what we can do with that community pharmacy there. And we're looking to potentially change that pharmacy away from a volume-based contract to one that is based on outcomes and population, which completely changes the whole way we can then do things. Because one of the primary blockers in the relationship between the pharmacy and the practice is around that contractual nature, around that there's always a perception that pharmacies are trying to build volume, which is entirely opposite to what they're trying to do. So the intention here is to align us behind a set of key principles so we can all work together on the common objectives. And the other key issue with that, of course, is then you start moving from a supply model to a service model for pharmacy, which again completely changes the way we will operate. Then that's about workforce change. So we're trying to change a series of competencies and the skill mix in the pharmacy. So we have been lucky enough to secure a number of new prescribing places, and we have effectively loaded Plymouth with those. So of those that I've got, more than half of them are going to be located in the Plymouth area. We're looking at skill mix and also broader clinical team activities as well, and the role of pharmacists in practice. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. We're creating joint education networks and training programs as well. Actually, let's just go into a bit. So the bit where we're going into more detail. So when we had difficulties in one of the primary care areas around Ocean, we were approached to say, what can you do to help? And the reality is our response time we were given was relatively short. We had to do something within 2 or 3 weeks. And the reality is we couldn't do much within that time period. So we have gone to NHS England and we've created, not everywhere, but we're creating a series of 2 or 3 cohorts around Devon, and one will certainly be in Plymouth, where we're going to deep training of a couple of groups of people. And we'll be doing prescribing, disease management, phlebotomy, spirometry, clinical history taking, assessment management, minor illness, expanding ERD, clinical system skills, professional diplomas, and the other bit of work we're doing actually, which is a more general piece, which is navigation training. We'll do that with the practices to make sure we have consistent approach to that. And the purpose for doing this is that if we get that call again, we will be able to do something and say, yes, we can help you on this, 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 and this.
David, can you just explain what phlebotomy is and
Oh, right, it's
spirometry?
blood. It's taking blood. Sorry. And alongside that, I was talking about general practice and the way we're trying to train people together. And the reason kind of is this, is that we now recognise that not only is the system one between community pharmacy and general practice, the pharmacy system is one as well. The way we work between the pharmacists in hospitals, the way the pharmacists in practice work, and the way the community pharmacists work, that they have to be linked to the hip. And actually, the fact we now got pharmacists in practice is helping very, very significantly in gluing the system together for us. So in terms of medicine's optimization and medicine management, it's really helping the flow of complex patients through into the community. And we're using those people to start creating networks of clinical excellence in their areas. So, and they're using social media, etc., to glue those systems together. So they all now talk to each other about clinical practice in a much more significant way than they used to. So it's growing the skills base. So it is significantly helping us glue the whole system together. And then we're doing a recruitment collaborative as well around web and social media. So we recognised that we couldn't get pharmacists into the area. And what was happening is generally we were just moving them around. One was poaching from another, one was poaching them back, etc. And effectively all the staff are just moving around. And this is a pretty consistent theme in health, unfortunately, that what happens is you don't really solve a problem, you just move it. So we've decided that we're not going to do that anymore. And so we've got together across the Southwest and said, we are going to work as a collaborative. We're going to have an approach whereby we will endeavour not to poach, and we will endeavour to get people in from people outside the territory. You can't, obviously there are employment law issues, so you can't obviously promise not to poach. But the intent is to try and go off patch as far as we possibly can in recruitment. Alongside that, there's leadership change, so we're moving really from national to local and even to accountable care organisations, etc. Now that doesn't come easily for pharmacy with lots of multiples, etc. There are difficulties in that because obviously all their models are sent out to be national and the way they operate is very slick, very efficient, but that creates not necessarily a strength in local leadership that some other organisations have got. So that's something we're trying to turn on its head. And some enablers around that are things like the quality premium, which we're working on. We're working with, as I say, the NAPC around primary care home and the Pharmaceutical Society to try and actually get some greater local leadership and strategy. So just to let you know what's happened in the contract, because you may not be aware of. So pharmacy has been, it's like a quaff. So pharmacy now effectively got a quaff. So we are now being driven, all the pharmacies should now have everyone being dementia friends. That's one of the things this year. The great majority of them will be healthy living pharmacies, which means that they will have healthy living champions, etc. in their pharmacies. They'll all have undergone safeguarding training. They'll all should have published their patient surveys. They should have made sure all their DOS things about their services are correct on 111 so we can be directed to us correctly. They should be accessing heavily summary care records, should be doing some safety reports, and should be doing some significant work on respiratory this year. So you can see that what that's trying to do, there's alignment here between the way we operate and the way other organisations operate. And then finally, really it's about behaviour change, and this is probably the biggest bit. So we're looking at, how do we move from our current thing, where we've basically been a silo, to being viewed as actually really working on the way that patients flow through the system, demand management, etc. Driving collaborative working. So we've created lots. Again, we're very new at this. We're one of the first in the country, but we've created lots of joint roles now across the Southwest, where you have pharmacists working in a community pharmacy, but also in a practice, or in a hospital or in a community, etc. So there are joint roles emerging. We're rotationally training people now at pre-reg level through the various aspects of pharmacy. They're not now doing it in one location, they're doing it in several. And we're doing things such as urgent care work, where we're saying Devonport, we're looking at that pharmacy is next to a practice, it's next to an MIU. And what we're doing there is looking at how we can use that pharmacy. So they've always got prescribers in that pharmacy, how we can use it to support the MIU, who haven't always got prescribers. And those pharmacists are also dropping into the practice and working jointly in there. So we're creating a health system as opposed to 3 silos. And in places like Beacon, we've been doing collaborative flu, whereas most of the country's been fighting tooth and dogs over actually supplying flu vaccines. We've actually been working collaboratively, and their vaccine numbers have gone up substantially as a consequence of that, where we're working with the population. So you can see there's a lot of joint activity going through, and there's some bit around contractual change. So this is the point where we talk a bit more about Saltash Road model very quickly. So the intent here is to look at the demand and just think about what do we need to move through to a GP. We're converting that Saltash Road pharmacies to have large GP size consulting rooms in it. And the intent is to spin off as much urgent care as we can through the front house into the pharmacy and only move through the complex stuff back to the GP practice, which we can link through to. And the low complexity long-term condition can be dealt with in that pharmacy in consultation area, etc. And repeat management hopefully can be done there as well. And the intent is to just have minimise the requirement to attend practice. So the areas of work that we think we can cover in here are urgent care, some of the independent prescriber stuff around upper respiratory, soft tissue, etc. Repeat authorisation, medicines reviews, taking referrals from primary pharmacy, the phlebotomy, the monitoring, etc. And with that, actually, the intent is to do some of the monitoring that requires doing before they issue new medications, so we can create a better process for the patient, so they don't have to come back. And we want to look at long-term conditions, data interrogation for meds optimization, managing discharges, which we're already now doing, actually, from we just started doing that from the hospital, screening for AF, dementia, etc., medication, education, falls prevention, substance misuse, equipment services, the prevention agenda, which, by the way, the Saltash Road thing, part of their contract will be to do outreach around public health issues as well, into schools, etc. Care home support, and the other bit we'll be doing here is about using our drivers to go and do safeguarding in the community, and improved access, things like extending hours of practices. So quite a broad range of things. And the intent now is basically to move that forward, to model that, learn from it. We can't go from here to there in one step, so it's a stepped approach over 3 or 4 steps. We'll gradually build competencies, and we'll be able to build more of that in as we go over a period. It'll probably take us three years plus to get to that final end result. But we've now got all those pharmacists becoming on prescribing training courses, and we have built the first stage, and the contract will go live, we're hoping, by the end of the year to do the first stage of that process. So we're working to develop that model and learn from it. We're going to align to the hub approach. What I haven't mentioned is we're also getting, hopefully, a bid about 111 services, so we can do some additional work here around transferring 111 calls more to pharmacy, and eventually we're hoping that will link to a linked telephony system from the GP, so we can spin off even more into the pharmacy. The intent is to pull as much out as we possibly can out of the practices. We're looking there to continue to drive on recruitment, further engage with the STP, because we are engaged, but possibly not enough around this change activity. They're not fully aware of all the stuff we're doing. And then further work with practices and federations, looking for quick wins, and examining further approaches to become truly integrated. So we think we've got some of the answers. We're investigating others. And I just wanted you guys to be aware, really, we are definitely leading the way nationally on a lot of these issues. We are looked to as the go-to region for some of these developing ideas around pharmacy. So I think there's a lot to be applauded from NHS England's perspective in supporting us on some of this journey. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed. I've got David first, and then Councillor Bridgman.
Thank you, Chair. David, thank you for your presentation. Very involved, and I should only retain a small part of that. So perhaps if we could have some copies of your overheads, if you wouldn't mind.
Of course.
I did pick up one of your slides which said, what is the problem? What are the problems? Lack of financial resource and headroom to experiment.
Yeah.
can I say, with all due respect, I think there's substantial savings to be made in addressing the medicine waste. There's a lot of medicine waste which goes on in the pharmacies, whether that's overprescribing of by the doctors, or whether it's I don't know, patients hoarding up their drugs. But I know when they bring them back, they can't be used again, they have to be destroyed. That seems a huge amount of money being lost, which could be used in other directions. So I'm just wondering what the pharmacist is doing to try to address that situation, because millions of pounds could be saved, and that could be put to other use.
Okay, so there's two aspects to that. In that new contract I talked about, one of the elements is about medicines waste. So one of the that new contractual type we talked about will be a block contract, but the top end of it will be a performance measured, and part of that, one of the performance metrics is around reducing wastage. So that's part of that process. But in the broader system, because of course that's just one pharmacy, in the broader system, what we're trying to do around the patch now is really push on electronic repeat dispensing, to get away from that managed repeat system, to have it all on electronically on the system. So there is a great push for that. That won't be the total answer, but it's a bit of the answer. The real difficulty is making sure at that point of interface with the public, each time we issue medicines, that the stuff they got is what they really need. You know, we do need to work more on those conversations at that particular point. But ERD is part of the solution, but it isn't the full one. But we are very much pushing to drive that, not only because of wastage, but also it reduces effort both in the pharmacy and in the practice.
And can I just say that with regard to the IT system, I have noticed in the pharmacies which the IT system in the pharmacy doesn't actually talk to the IT system in the actual practice itself, and there's this strange effect of the prescriptions being not all prescribed at the same time, but in different sections. You know, they have to go back and get another one. If there's three prescriptions on there, they're done in 3 different types. You know, so it doesn't make sense to me. So the IT systems need to talk to each other.
Yeah, they are. The actual GP systems and our patient medication systems are different. There is a link system which is the electronic prescription service, where it flows between the two. So there is a bit of a link there, but I would concur. And there are also issues whereby we know that only some medicines can be issued on the electronic system, some still have to come on a green form. So there will always be some disconnect until we would change the law around that issue. Yeah, I completely concur. It would be much better if we had a far more integration of that, of the platforms. But as I say, the issue is around information governance. We have not yet fully resolved to allow something like that to happen.
Can I just remind panel that we're actually looking at primary care, not medicines, etc. So I think we just need to make sure that we focus on how we see that pharmacy and pharmacists will improve that primary care functions. Councillor Bridgman.
I don't know where to start here, really. Thank you, Chair. Questions within questions.
Okay.
I mean, the first thing, basically, when I go to the pharmacy, the pharmacist is the person who dispenses the drugs. So who's going to dispense the drugs while the pharmacist is acting as a GP? Because that's how this kind of looks to me. That's the first thing. Now, also, the pharmacists have taken on all these additional duties. So I'm wondering how you're going to manage their pay expectations. And if they can't be managed, who's going to, is there budget? How will this be funded? And I'm just wondered, is there a risk that this service could actually only be available to people who can afford to pay for it? So there's lots of questions there.
Okay.
Thank you.
So there's certainly no intent about the latter. Absolutely no intent around payment. The only caveat I had on that is obviously there is this debate around some medicines that are currently PGSL, whether they will still be prescribed or not. There is consultation about that at the moment. So that was the only caveat I would put around that. Sorry, pharmacy-only medicines and general sales list medicines. So those that can be bought in a pharmacy or over the counter. So there is a consultation in process around that. In terms of resourcing, I understand entirely the question, so, because actually the pharmacists are fairly busy in that supply chain process. The intent, however, is to shift them to become far more clinically orientated and away from that supply chain, because the question is where can they add most value in terms of the care of patients? And what we can do is think about what, in the same way a GP has oversight over the general practice processes, the pharmacists can have oversight over the practices that are going on in the pharmacy. We already have checking technicians whereby we do the clinical checks, and most of the rest of the process can occur as a consequence of that clinical check. And if you start taking some of those workforce modelling changes into account, you can free up a lot of the pharmacist's time to do some of these activities. In terms of funding, it isn't necessarily creating costs, it's about moving costs around the system that we're talking about here, and moving value around the system in order to improve efficiency and effectiveness. So that's what we're looking at endeavouring to do.
Thank you, Chair. Have you done a risk register? How are you going to manage the risk? Because I think this is really important, because if a pharmacist misses something that a GP would pick up quite easily, it's just obviously I'm thinking about just people.
Yeah, indeed. So obviously the clinical risk piece here is about working together with the practice and how we work together as a collective around that issue. Yes, that there are risks. There are risks in the system currently, and it's about how we jointly manage those risks that we're talking about here. And yes, there will be risk registers, and there are indemnities, etc., that need to be in place as we go down this route. And absolutely, they have been thought about. Just as we thought about how we're going to do that same thing, have them pharmacists within a practice. There are indemnities and risk sharing, etc., that needs to be considered.
Out of curiosity, how much training do pharmacists have?
Right, so they have, it's a 4-year degree course, which is a master's degree, and then you have a year's pre-registration. And then going on from that now, it's increasingly, you can have a foundation programme because after that, and then the faculty is beginning to be built after that, so it's pretty well ongoing, really. But to actually be qualified, it's the 4-year degree course plus a year pre-registration.
Pretty impressive. And from my perspective, certainly having a pharmacist in a primary care practice takes a lot of the pressure off a GP and for the rest of the team. So I can really see the value within that. So I suppose I'm a little bit surprised to find that pharmacy doesn't appear to be in the proposals that NHS England and the CCG have put forward. So why do you think that is?
It's in what proposal you were discussing here, because we are linked into a lot of this planning. Oh, that one.
We're looking at the primary care improvement plan for the Western locality.
Okay. Well, it's fair to say, though, that we have been working quite closely with Nicola and Mark and the others around developing what we're doing here. It has been with support from them. We've got the some support to do the medical prescribing places. We've also had support from NHS England to do some of this contractual work. So it may not be written in there, but we are very much linked into the process. I'll have to have a word about that.
We'll look for Mark 2 of this one. Okay, Councillor Tuffin.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, David. It's nice to see you again.
And you?
I recall talking to you a couple of years ago about it. And it's really nice to know you've not lost any of your enthusiasm for how pharmacies could help the GP situation. But a couple of points. Who are you collaborating with? I think it was slightly covered there. But is it CCGs or is it NHS England with your direction of travel that you wish to go?
I'm collaborating with just about everyone I can, be honest. So to be honest with you, in terms of helping us on our journey, we've had the AHSN, the CCGs, NHS England, the Pharmaceutical Society. There are a whole range of people who are assisting us through this process, largely probably because we are actually doing things that are novel and new. But certainly, I don't think we've had any particular people blocking what we're trying to do. They've generally all been pretty supportive of us in our direction. So you know, I can't see. I haven't had any great issue, to be honest with you.
Okay, thank you for that, David. I'm all in favour of an integrated health system because I feel it works best for the interest of patients. And it's difficult to see how that works with pharmacists because I assume they're individual business units plus self-employed business setups. So that kind of gives me a little bit of concern because we've heard today that NHS England, as soon as a doctor decides they want to retire or things are too difficult for them, they've got that ability to walk away. And it would concern me that pharmacies would be in that same position because we don't want to go on in the same way. I think we need a new kind of practice to make that work. So that's one of my concerns, and you know I welcome your answer to that. The other thing is I've talked to pharmacists, and many of them, or at least two of them, said they would like to be prescribing medication, but they said the training's almost impossible for them because they can't take the time out to do the training. So I would see that as a big help to GP shortages.
Okay.
So have you got any kind of response to that?
Well, we've got 10 from Plymouth on the prescribing course. The next one comes starting in January. It isn't easy arranging that, and we've had to play some smoke and mirrors games to achieve that goal, but we've got there. So that's doable. In terms of the integration, yeah, it's tricky. They are privately owned businesses, but then so a lot of practices in terms of them being partnerships. We clearly have also an issue where there's this national and local issue that we need to play through. But there is a recognition now amongst even the multiples that there is a need for change for them. So that they have actually in the last few weeks started talking about how they might want to get involved in trying some different models locally here. And we are looking about, you know, with practice about what would it mean to do a different contractual type around a population. How would we do that? Would they have to throw their contracts in the ring as well? So we're by no means there, but we are beginning to have that conversation, which if you asked me a year ago, I would say they would never do that. So there are the beginnings of discussions around how we might do things differently. Clearly, you know, when you're trying to create a whole model around a population, there will be financial risks for those that get involved in it, and it's how we think about how we manage those risks that will enable us to try and take some steps in that direction. And can I just come back to your point again as well? Sorry. You're mentioning about, I forgot to say, about pharmacists becoming doctors. Well, they're taking on some of the capabilities or the competences of doctors to some degree, but we've always, if you look back 50 odd years, that's what we would have always have done in terms of pharmacy used to be the first port of call for a lot of this anyway. So it's taking us back in a way to doing far more of what we used to do and actually what they do on the continent, to be honest. But I don't want to really think of us as a replacement GP. That's not what we're about. Actually, it's a supplementary role. So where we put pharmacists alongside GPs in practices, it's not just about duplicating that activity at all. That's not the purpose. They come with a different skill set, which actually improves the outcomes for patients by working in partnership with practices. So when I go and talk to GPs about, you know, and I do, about what's going right and what's going wrong with these pharmacists going to practice so we can continue to involve it, what we find is that, yeah, it's not a perfect fit in all instances, but they would never let them go because they're adding real value to the practices in terms of the additional resource and capability they bring to that unit.
Councillor Carson.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Actually, that leads me nicely on to this, David. Mark Proctor suggested earlier that that Barton may be led by a pharmacy. Do you see that as viable?
Well, it's slightly tricky to talk too much about Barton because there's a contract application at the moment. And we don't know exactly how that will pan out. But clearly, you know, if we looked at the model that's in Saltash Road, that could be an option. But at the moment, we're having a pharmacy needs assessment going through, and we've got an application going through, and it is quite difficult to understand where we will actually end up at. But it does look like we will end up with a pharmacy in that area that maybe, depending on outcomes of discussions, may be able to offer something more. But we can't foretell the future at this point in time because the contract application hasn't been resolved yet.
It begs the question: are you happy to take the lead?
What in terms of
that providing that service in that area?
Well, it wouldn't be me personally.
No.
But there are actually pharmacy-run general practices now in London. Whatever you think about that, but in the type of model I was talking about earlier, they're not islands. They're not operating on their own. That one we talked about earlier has an agreement with 4 general practices about how they're going to work in partnership. And in that type of circumstance, where you can offer an improved care to that population as part of a system, yeah, absolutely. But you know, with that proviso, that it must make sure it works as part of that system.
Thank you. Councillor Sparling.
Okay, hello, David. I'm particularly interested in what you've had to say on the shortage of pharmacists here in the southwest, but not elsewhere. The workforce change portion of your presentation assisted somewhat with how you were responding. And my question is, how extensive is the shortage? Do you know if any work has been done on why the southwest particularly faces that shortage? And perhaps most importantly, what impact is this shortage having on the role that pharmacy is increasingly being asked to perform within primary care?
Okay, so yeah, without doubt, the role of pharmacists is expanding not just in primary care, but also in acute trusts where they're being used in A&Es and more and more on boards. So the requirement is growing, which isn't making our life much easier in terms of recruitment. The southwest, that there are a number of reasons we believe. Partly remoteness. It's partly down to the fact we've not got a pharmacy school. Our closest pharmacy school is Bath, which is quite some distance, and then you've got Cardiff and Brighton. And you know, and actually there's Plymouth's slightly different, but as a southwest in general, there's a lack of urbanality, which doesn't help bring in young people. When we get them, we often hold them, but it's actually getting them in the first place that's quite tricky. So I can't definitively, we haven't surveyed to establish it, but that is the assumptions that we have made about where our difficulties are coming from.
Thank you very much, if I just may, but how extensive is it? Has there been a body of work done around that? How extensive is it, and what impact is it having on the role that you're being asked to perform in primary care?
Our last estimate is from Devon and Cornwall area, about 100 short.
Councillor Dan.
You answered a couple of my questions, because I was going to ask you if we were sort of moving towards the European model of pharmacy, where that sort of first level consultation takes place in the pharmacy. I suppose it's something for scrutiny, Chair. I was just thinking that it's difficult to, there's some really interesting stuff in here, but it's really difficult to look at in isolation. And I think we need to have something come back to us so we can see where this model is going to go out. And it's how our residents are going to get accessibility to healthcare. Because it is a support, but what would worry me is that I would hate to see some of the smaller doctor surgeries decline and then the pharmacies taking the place for that first tier of health support. But then when we actually need to get to a GP, they've got to jump on a bus or get a £10 taxi, because that's what worries me. And it's that layer stuff. So whether it comes perhaps when we look, not next week, when we look just at the consultation for the Health and Wellbeing Hub, but where we'll align work to the hub approach, I think that needs a lot more scrutiny moving forward. Yeah. So it's not really a question for you, but it's sort of a response to some of the things that you've said.
To make any comment from what Sue said?
I think that there is more work to be done about exactly how the system might look. Yes, but I think there's been substantial move forward though by Mark and others over the last year or so about trying to create that vision of the future. I think pharmacy clearly has. We have to remember that the majority of healthcare interventions occurring in the population do occur in the pharmacy. And it's about how we make that accessible and how we maximise the potential of that to improve patients' health is quite critical. So to some extent, the pharmacies are the outposts, and always have been. And it's a question of how much do we want to make of those, and how much do you want to draw the primary care stuff into a hub, and that is possibly the discussion you're talking about. Yeah.
Councillor Mahoney.
Thank you, Chair. David,
Hi, John.
you and your colleagues know an awful lot more about medicines, complications, interactions between various medications than we do as GPs. So do you see that if we can actually have pharmacists in most practices, or at least an input, it will reduce the problems that we have, particularly with elderly people with lots of complex illnesses who are on a lot of medication? I mean, this is a way forward in keeping people well and out of hospital, isn't it?
Yeah, I entirely concur with that. I think the evidence is that's already happening. That certainly seeing some benefit in that. There's also been some strong work with not actually pharmacists in practice, but hub pharmacists. They're using Torbay, whereby they're trying to look at particularly the elderly frail patients on 20 or more meds and seeing how they can reduce those and reduce risk. And that seems to be leading to benefit not only financially from cost reduction, but also in terms of outcomes for those patient groups. So without doubt, that's true, John.
Councillor Carson, yep.
Thank you, Chair. David, you said that the nearest university for a pharmacist is Bath. Do you see a need for one in Plymouth? Is that something?
Don't get me started. There were some years ago we were quite close, and in fact I think, I'm not sure if I should say this, but I will anyway. I believe that the money was actually set aside at one point at Plymouth to do so. But unfortunately, at that point, there was a real discussion about whether they were going to cap places, etc., which changed the dynamic and the environment. And as a consequence, that didn't happen. And I don't think there is any current appetite to move back in that direction. Would we want one? We would love one. We would love one. As a group of pharmacists down here, we think it could substantially help the clinical network that we would create. But I don't think that would be straightforward to achieve.
From speaking personally from somebody that we've been fortunate to have a pharmacist within the practice that I go to, they're worth their weight in gold. They really, really are. I mean, I've certainly been taking medication for many, many years to find out I was taking it completely wrong. So, never too old to learn. David, thank you very much indeed for coming and giving us your time today. We really appreciate it. And, I'm pleased with what you're telling us the future could possibly be. And it seems a very sensible way forward. We're very fortunate with some of our pharmacists in Plymouth that they've been in Plymouth for a long time. They're well respected and they are that port of call that you go to. So thank you, and we look forward to you joining us when they've updated their plan and we can see how you're then mentioned in it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, panel, we need to think about doing some recommendations. Could I just ask for 2 seconds a break, please? And then yeah, because we've been here for a good 3 hours plus.
Excellent idea.
Through you, Chair. So given you've been here now nearly 3 hours plus, good job, yeah. We've had a huge amount of information. We've had some stuff that's just come in today. We've picked a few things up in terms of recommendations as we've gone, but you are meeting again on the 13th of December. So certainly what we can do is work with the chair to come up, the chair and the vice chair to come up with some recommendations that might be acceptable to you. It does feel like Councillor Aspinall said at the start, this is a start of a process rather than covering it all off in this meeting. So we'll come up with some recommendations, we'll circulate them, and then you can approve them as a group on the 13th of December.
Yep. We'll send them out earlier for those.
okay, are you all happy with
very good.
that suggestion?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you can...
Well, can I thank you, panel, for your help this afternoon. I think we certainly are beginning to I think we're getting that grounding as to what some of the problems are. As for the solutions, that's a different matter.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that will be something that we need to be bringing back to panel to make sure that we're happy with the work plans that are and whatever that are being put into place, and that we will be challenging those that we feel aren't, you know, for the benefit of Plymouth citizens. Okay, thank you very much indeed.